The moment the black crystal announced that I had awakened necromancy, every person in the academy hall backed away from me. That was fair. Necromancers were rare, illegal in 3 regions, and famous for turning family reunions into military emergencies. The examiner slammed a red alarm plate. Instructors drew weapons. Students who had spent years laughing at my weak mana suddenly remembered urgent business on the other side of the room. For 8 beautiful seconds, I was the most terrifying person alive. Then the examiner rolled a dog skeleton onto the stage and ordered me to raise it. I touched the skull. Nothing happened. I poured mana into the ribs. Still nothing. Someone suggested a human bone. The examiner looked as if he regretted his career, but he brought out a sealed finger bone from the academy vault. I touched that too. My skill rejected it so completely that the crystal flashed an error. Silas laughed first. He was the academy favorite, a brilliant flamecaster with silver hair, perfect scores, and the irritating habit of looking kind while he humiliated people. Once he started, the whole hall joined him. The examiner kept testing. A dead rat failed. A preserved bird failed. A jar containing something I chose not to identify failed. Finally, while I was leaning against the stage and reconsidering every decision that had brought me there, my hand brushed the wilted flowers beside the crystal. The stems twitched. Violet light crawled through their veins. Brown petals lifted from the table, bleached to the color of old bone, and turned toward me like tiny faces. The hall went silent again. I focused on the flowers and felt a memory that was not mine. Warm soil, rain against leaves, then scissors, a vase, thirst, the slow collapse of cells after the water ran dry. The crystal finally displayed the full name of my class. Gravebloom Necromancer. Plant matter only. There would be no skeleton army. No zombies. No ghost knights riding through midnight fog. I could command wilted flowers, dead roots, old trees, dry vines, and rotten seeds. Silas wiped tears from his eyes. He told everyone I had awakened as a gardener who was late to work. The examiner tried to find some combat value. He scattered dry beans across the table. I revived one. It grew 6 pale roots, crawled in a circle, and then lay down because a bean had never learned how to do anything more impressive. I animated a splinter. It jumped. A piece of paper folded itself in half and nearly killed me through embarrassment. The instructors lowered their weapons. Fear became pity, which somehow felt worse. My provisional academy admission was about to be cancelled when a crash shook the practical arena next door. One of the goblins used for combat tests had broken its collar. It came through the side door with a spear in one hand and an instructor's blood on the other. Everyone who had mocked me moved at once, but not toward the goblin. They ran behind the stage. Silas stepped forward with fire gathering over his palm. The goblin grabbed a first-year student and held the spear to his throat. Silas stopped. His spell was powerful enough to burn through both of them. The examiner shouted for a barrier team. The goblin dragged its hostage toward the outer doors. I was still standing beside a decorative arch wrapped in dead ivy from last winter's graduation ceremony. That was when I learned the difference between a weak skill and a skill no one had bothered to understand. I touched the ivy. Death rushed into me. Frost. Dry air. Months of clinging to the arch after every living cell had cracked. But beneath that death was the oldest behavior a vine possessed. Find support. Wrap around it. Climb. I gave it mana and one new direction. The dead ivy flashed bone white. 20 thin strands ripped free of the arch, slid across the floor, and past the hostage without touching him. The goblin saw them too late. Vines coiled around its ankles, wrists, and jaw. It stabbed one strand, but every broken piece became another moving cord. When it tried to bite, the vine remembered how to tighten around a branch in a storm. I pulled my fist closed. The goblin hit the floor so hard that its spear bounced into the examiner's hands. No explosion, no heroic firestorm, just a dead vine doing what it had always done, except now I got to choose what counted as a tree. The hostage crawled away. Silas's spell faded. For the first time, he was not laughing. I should have enjoyed that longer. But the ivy began dragging the goblin toward me. I had told it to find support, and apparently it considered my legs excellent support. I canceled the spell before it wrapped me into my own victory pose. The hall erupted. Half the students cheered because the goblin was down. The other half immediately claimed they had never doubted me. The examiner stared at the crystal, then at the immobilized monster, and restored my provisional admission. Restoring my admission did not mean the academy understood what to do with me. They moved the remaining tests to a stone room and placed 3 instructors behind barriers. Apparently a dry vine had restored some of the original panic. They gave me a dead oak branch and asked for maximum force. I made it swing. The branch struck a training dummy hard enough to leave a shallow dent, then split down the middle. Silas melted the same kind of dummy with one flame lance. The score crystal gave me 4 points and him 96. Then the examiner asked for precision. I revived a sheet of paper, tore it into narrow strips, and sent each strip through a different ring hanging across the room. Paper remembered flexing in wind and folding under pressure. I did not have to control every turn. I only had to choose which old behavior applied. The strips passed through all 20 rings, tied themselves around the target bells, and rang them in order. The score crystal hesitated, then gave me a result it had not used before, unclassified. Silas tried to make that sound like failure. I noticed he stopped standing near paper. The endurance test revealed a worse limitation. I raised a training shield made from dead bamboo and held it against repeated stone shots. Every impact entered the bamboo's death memory. After the 10th, my own arms bruised even though nothing touched them. A revived plant shared the sensation of its destruction with me, and cancellation did not erase what I had already felt. I changed the shield into a loose bundle. Instead of resisting the next stone, the bamboo separated, bent around it, and reassembled. The impact vanished across 50 pieces. My pain dropped with it. That became my first real principle. I would never win by making dead plants pretend to be steel. Plants survived by bending, branching, shedding, clinging, poisoning, hiding, and returning after conditions changed. My class was not a weaker version of ordinary necromancy. It followed a completely different set of instincts. The examiner still ranked me last for destructive power. Silas stood first. When the students filed out, he paused beside the revived flowers and pinched one pale petal between his fingers. It blackened before he released it. He said weak powers made people reckless because they confused surprise with strength. I told him predictable strength made people stand too close to dry decorations. The ivy behind him lifted 1 inch. Silas left without turning his back again. I knelt to recover the vine. When one pale tendril brushed the goblin's claws, it recoiled. Plants did not have eyes, but they remembered harm. The vine showed me a flash of black powder eating through green tissue. The same powder was packed beneath the goblin's nails. Before the creature had escaped, it had been digging somewhere filled with engineered ash. The vine lifted its tip and pointed straight down. Silas saw it. His friendly smile returned a fraction too late. The next morning, the academy sent us into an abandoned orchard for our entry trial. The rules were simple. Teams had 2 hours to retrieve 3 bronze tags while avoiding traps and low-ranked monsters. The academy had burned the orchard after a disease outbreak, so the instructors considered it neutral terrain. Booze! To me, it looked like an armory. Rows of blackened trees stretched over the hills. Rotten apples lay beneath them. Dead roots crossed under every path. I could barely take 1 step without hearing small echoes of frost, flame, axes, or thirst. My assigned partner was Harper, a poison alchemist who carried glass tubes in a reinforced belt and regarded human optimism as a curable illness. She did not care that I was a necromancer. She cared that I had almost wrapped myself in ivy. She told me that if my plants tried to hug her, she would dissolve both them and me. It was the warmest welcome I received all week. Our first bronze tag hung over a clearing guarded by 6 goblins. A normal team would have charged. I revived 4 rotten apples instead. Their skins turned white and rolled downhill like tiny skulls. When the goblins stepped closer, I made the fruit repeat its final act of decomposition all at once. The apples burst into clouds of mold. The goblins stumbled out coughing. Harper flicked a tube into the cloud, and her alchemical vapor turned the harmless spores bright blue. Now we could see every breath, every movement, and every footprint inside the fog. I sent dead roots up around their ankles and took the tag without throwing a punch. Harper pretended not to be impressed. She asked why the roots had known where to rise. I touched one and showed her. The connected root system carried vibration. When revived, it felt every footstep as pressure along its dead fibers. I was not seeing through the orchard. I was listening with 1,000 buried fingers. That discovery almost killed us. The moment I extended my awareness, pain struck from every direction. I felt the orchard burning years earlier. Sap boiled beneath bark. Roots clawed deeper for water that was not there. I dropped to my knees with smoke in my lungs even though the air was clean. Harper snapped a sharp-smelling capsule under my nose. She did not heal me. Her mixture simply shocked my senses hard enough to separate my body from the orchard's memory. She ordered me to use 10 roots instead of 10,000 until I learned the difference between power and stupidity. I disliked her tone. I followed her advice. The second tag was inside an old packing barn. The academy had filled it with swinging blades, but the building itself was dead wood. I revived one floorboard, felt the nails and weight through its memory, and made it tilt. Then another. The floor passed us across the room like a slow wooden wave while every blade missed. Halfway across, the barn changed its rhythm. The swinging blades stopped following the visible gears. One cut through the floor directly ahead of Harper. I pulled the board backward, but a second blade dropped behind us. Someone outside was controlling the trap manually. I spread mana through the wall beams and listened to their pressure. Deadwood remembered every force passing through it. The hidden operator tugged one cable, and the nearest post felt the tension before the blade moved. I started reading the barn instead of watching the traps. Left wall tightened. I ducked. Roof beam shifted. Harper stepped forward. Floor joist flexed. We jumped together while two blades crossed beneath us. The operator accelerated until the barn became a machine trying to cut apart its own skeleton. I let the blades strike. Each impact severed another board, giving me smaller pieces with faster control. Splinters rose in clouds around the cables. I could not cut metal, but I could pack the gear teeth with wood. The whole trap locked at once. Harper found a warm control lever behind a false wall. Whoever had operated it had left seconds earlier. A single silver thread clung to the handle, too fine to prove anything and too deliberate to ignore. We were reaching for the tag when the entire barn went quiet. My floorboard stopped responding. White salt poured from slots in the walls. It settled into the cracks and broke the lines of violet mana between each board. The trial designers had prepared for ordinary necromancy, and salt disrupted the command structures of dead matter, whether that matter had once walked or grown. 3 goblins dropped from the rafters. Unlike the first group, these wore crude breathing masks. Someone had changed the trial after seeing my apple trick. Harper sprayed resin over the nearest salt line. The grains clumped together, and my mana crossed the gap again. I kicked up a floorboard beneath one goblin, folded a wooden crate around another, and made an old broom chase the third with so much enthusiasm that even Harper laughed. We found a pinch of black ash mixed into the salt. It matched the powder beneath the escaped goblin's claws. Harper sealed a sample in glass. This was not part of the academy trial. Someone was using the orchard to test how my ability failed. We had one tag left when the root network warned me of movement at the northern fence. A group of candidates had been trapped inside a living thorn enclosure with goblins circling outside. The thorns were green. I could not command them, and any wide attack would hit the students. The trial clock showed 12 minutes. Our third tag waited in the opposite direction. If we left the trapped group and took it, we passed. If we helped, we almost certainly failed. Harper was already running toward the fence. She claimed it was because dead candidates produce paperwork, but I knew then why she had been assigned to a combat academy instead of a laboratory. She could look at a losing calculation and decide the numbers were rude. The goblins had stretched living thorn branches across every opening. My dead roots could attack from below, but once they crossed the salt trench around the enclosure, my control vanished. Harper had enough resin for one narrow bridge, not an army, so I did not send an army. I revived a single buried root and pushed all my mana into its memory of growth. It could not become alive again, but it remembered branching. Bone-white fibers split through the soil until they reached the salt trench. Harper poured her last resin in a line no wider than my thumb. One root crossed, then branched again on the other side. The goblins felt the ground move and stabbed downward. I let them. Each cut produced another dead end I could redirect. Pale roots emerged inside the enclosure, not to attack, but to lift the living thorn bushes from beneath. Their green branches bent upward without dying, opening a tunnel for the trapped candidates. 2 goblins rushed the exit with their captives between us. I could not strike through them. Then I noticed the collapsed orchard ladders beside the fence. They were willow, dead and dry, with enough flexible memory left to bend. I raised 3 ladders on their sides. They ran like long wooden insects, slid beneath the hostages and carried them away. The goblins stood confused for exactly as long as I needed. My roots folded around them from behind. The candidates escaped. The clock reached 0. Harper and I had only 2 tags. The instructor's announcement did not end the danger. The salt trench ignited. Black ash hidden under the grains flashed into a low ring of fire. It was not hot enough to kill us quickly. It was designed to drive every surviving goblin and candidate toward the living thorn enclosure, where panic would create a pile of bodies. My root network had already crumbled from the rescue. Harper had spent her resin. The ladders carried 2 injured candidates and could not move fast enough. I looked at the rotten apples covering the hillside. Earlier I had used them as spore bombs. This time I raised hundreds without rupturing them. The apples rolled through the orchard in branching streams, gathering dew and soft mud on their skins. Harper understood and threw her empty chemical tubes into the flow. The glass crushed under the fruit, releasing the last drops of cooling compounds. The rotten apple tide hit the burning salt. Steam covered the fence. Salt dissolved into the wet pulp, and the command-breaking ring became a conductive slurry rich with dead plant matter. I sent Gravebloom through it. Every apple split into pale roots. They did not attack the goblins. They wove a moving carpet under the candidates. The entire group slid downhill on thousands of tiny root legs, while the goblins stumbled in the opposite direction. Harper stood on the front like the captain of the world's least dignified ship, throwing moldy fruit at anything that came close. Vanning Girldies, the Cap'n Barrier team, finally arrived. They extinguished the ash fire and stared at the orchard path we had left behind. A white river of roots, blue mold, broken glass, and 3 goblins tied to a walking ladder. We had failed the scoring rules. We had also rescued 11 people from a trap no instructor had authorized. That made our failure difficult to celebrate. An instructor announced our failure, but the orchard was not finished speaking. The huge root I had sacrificed to the rescue was crumbling. As it died a second time, its memory spilled through me. Years ago, before the fire, someone had knelt beside the tree and pressed black ash into a cut in its trunk. I saw academy shoes, a silver strand of hair, a smiling face reflected in a rain puddle. Silas. The memory was blurred, but Harper saw enough through the violet projection to stop smiling. Then the root showed us something stranger. The ash had not merely killed the orchard, it had forced every root to carry one message toward the sealed grove beyond the academy wall. Wake up. Something under that grove had been sleeping for 500 years, and Silas had been trying to make it remember. The academy did not reward us for uncovering sabotage. It gave us 6 penalty points for leaving the marked route and scheduled the sealed grove for removal before sunrise. That told me 2 things. First, someone important did not want us investigating. Second, if I waited for permission, I would wake up to a very clean patch of dirt. Harper found me outside the archive building after midnight. She had the black ash sample inside a metal case, and a list of reasons my plan was terrible. Beside her stood Owen, a rune engraver whose academy uniform was permanently stained with silver ink. He studied combat history because, according to him, dead people made fewer corrections. We showed him the fragment of root memory. He did not accuse us of forging it. He complained that we had projected a 500-year clue onto wet soil without recording it properly. That was how Owen joined us. The sealed grove occupied a hollow beyond the training wall. Most of its trees had been cut down generations ago. The only thing left was a stump wider than a house, black on the outside and smooth as stone where countless visitors had touched it. Memorial flowers surrounded the roots. Every flower had wilted because the academy had stopped watering them. For once, neglect was useful. I placed both hands on the stump and used grave bloom. Nothing moved. The wood was dead, but its death lay too far back. When I reached for its memory, I found centuries compressed into a wall. Rings of drought, lightning, war, winter, insects, and slow decay stood between me and the moment the tree fell. My mana vanished into those layers without reaching the center. Harper told me to stop before my heart did. Owen knelt near the roots and carved a receiving rune into a strip of dead bark. He explained that he could hold a memory once I reached it, but he could not make the journey for me. I looked at the wilted memorials. Thousands of people had left flowers here for a battle they no longer understood. Each stem held a little mana from the person who carried it, a little warmth from the hand that let it go, and a final memory of facing the stump. I revived every flower. White petals lifted across the hollow. Their roots were gone, so they could not walk, but they leaned into one another. I connected their final gazes, making a circle of borrowed attention around the stump. Then I sent their stored warmth inward. The old wood cracked. A violet line appeared beneath the bark. Then another. The stump did not grow. It inhaled. 500 years struck me at once. The grove vanished. I stood inside a forest so enormous that the clouds tangled in its canopy. At its center rose a world tree with a trunk like a mountain. Soldiers fought beneath it, but no human names survived in the stump's memory. It remembered iron-biting bark, fire-climbing branches, and a figure carrying a vessel of black ash. The figure wore no visible face. Wherever the ash touched, green leaves died without falling. Pale roots beneath the battlefield trapped shadowy shapes trying to rise from the soil. They were not bodies. They were souls stripped from both armies and pulled toward a red crack under the world tree. The stump's memory changed position. I was no longer watching from the edge. I was inside the root system under the battle. Every death above entered the soil as warmth. The world tree caught that warmth and tried to guide it away from the crack. The ash-bearing figure contaminated those pathways, turning roots meant to shepherd souls into chains. That was why ordinary records described the battle as a sudden madness. Soldiers on both sides heard the stolen voices of their own dead and attacked anything near the trees. I felt one ancient root make a desperate choice. It severed itself from the world tree, trapping several hundred souls in an isolated grove so the ash could not take them. That severed root became the stump we were touching now. The memorial flowers around us began whispering with those stored echoes. Not words, exactly. Impressions of shields, rain, terror, and relief that someone in the future had finally listened. Owen changed his rune pattern. Instead of recording one flat scene, he carved concentric rings to preserve viewpoints. The plate grew hot enough to blister his fingers. Harper poured cooling liquid around his hands while keeping the chemical away from the stump. The deeper layer revealed 3 symbols cut into the black ash vessel. One matched a decorative mark used throughout the academy arena. One resembled the ventilation pattern beneath the glass conservatory. The last was a root spiral Owen had seen under old city fountains. The ancient gate had not vanished. Its components had been disguised as modern infrastructure. Before we could capture the last symbol, a foreign flame entered the memory and began burning backward through time. Silas was not only destroying evidence in the present, he had mixed ash into the grove years ago so that any successful revival would trigger a fire inside the recalled image. I made the stump remember rain. 500 years of storms fell through the projection. The flame weakened long enough for Owen to finish one plate, but the effort opened every death echo at once. Harper pulled me away just before my own name disappeared beneath them. The tree defenders cut their own sacred roots to close that crack. The world tree fell, the forest burned. The stump before me had once been the smallest outer root of that impossible tree. Owen's rune plate screamed as he forced the memory into silver lines. Harper held me upright while I dragged my mind toward the final image. Before the world tree died, someone broke a piece from its heartwood and carried it into a palace made of glass, the glass conservatory. The stump spoke without words. Its rings pressed meaning into my bones. The ash had returned. The grave below the world was hungry again. Then fire cut through the memory. The revived flowers ignited in a perfect circle. Owen ripped his completed plate free, but a second plate beside him flew into the dark. Silas caught it. He stood at the top of the hollow wearing a gray cloak over his academy uniform. He did not bother pretending this was an accident. He congratulated me for opening a memory his people had failed to reach for years. I sent the memorial flowers at him. They became a blizzard of bone-white petals, each sharp with the stump's remembered pain. Silas swept one hand, and a curtain of flame erased half of them. That was his first adaptation. He had learned that if he destroyed plant structure completely, I had nothing left to command. So I stopped aiming at him. The remaining flowers wrapped around his fire and let themselves burn. Their ash filled the air. At that point, I could not control ash, but Silas did not know that. He raised a barrier around his face and lost sight of the ground. I revived the dead roots beneath his feet. The stump remembered him. Its roots rose like the fingers of a buried giant. Silas burned through the first, vaulted over the second, and deliberately dropped the stolen rune plate into his own flame. Owen lunged for it. Silas knew he would. A ribbon of black ash burst from the plate and wrapped around Owen's arm. Harper threw a neutralizing vial, saving his hand. But that choice opened a path out of the grove. Silas escaped because we chose Owen over pursuing him. It was not a mistake. It was exactly the kind of decision Silas was beginning to build his plans around. By sunrise, the academy discovered the grove torn open, the ancient stump awake, and 3 students standing in the center. Owen had one intact rune plate. Harper had enough black ash evidence to prove deliberate sabotage. I had a nosebleed that would not stop, and the world tree's last image burned into my thoughts. The academy postponed our punishment when the glass conservatory sealed itself. The conservatory was not a normal greenhouse. It was a botanical dungeon contained inside a glass dome, filled with living magical plants gathered from unstable gates. The world tree fragment rested in its central museum because no one had managed to identify it. The moment the stump awakened, every vine inside the dome grew toward that fragment. Silas entered through the roof before the emergency barriers closed. We went through the front. For the first time since awakening, I stood in a place overflowing with plants and had almost nothing to command. Green vines whipped across the entrance. Carnivorous flowers opened along the path. Even the moss under my shoes was annoyingly alive. Harper stopped me from killing the nearest vine just to make a weapon. If the ecosystem sensed widespread harm, the dungeon would accelerate growth until the dome burst. We needed to move through a jungle that became more dangerous whenever anything died. I reached for what the living plants had already discarded. Fallen leaves covered the path. Dead pollen clogged the vents. Shed bark lay beneath the oldest trees. I raised the leaves into a human-shaped decoy and filled it with pollen. The carnivorous flowers attacked, bit through the shell, and sneezed so violently that their stems tied themselves into knots. We crossed the first chamber under a storm of furious pollen. The pollen did more than annoy the flowers. It carried their alarm through the greenhouse. Living vines began sealing routes ahead of us, a canopy folded over the glass, turning noon into green darkness. Owen's runes needed visible surfaces, so he started marking the dead leaves and sending them forward like glowing moths. One leaf moth vanished, then a second. We found a pitcher plant the size of a room waiting around the next corner. Its open mouth looked like a harmless section of floor beneath the drifting leaves. The swallowed scouts had died before entering, which meant I could still feel them inside its stomach. I commanded the leaves to fold. They jammed the plant's drainage channels. Digestive liquid rose. The pitcher tried to close, but Harper froze a stripe along its rim. I took control of that dead stripe and forced the mouth open while Owen carved a rune on the exposed inner wall. The rune amplified the vibration of the plant's own struggling muscles. The pitcher panicked at the sound of itself and spat everything out, including 3 old museum keys, a metal boot, and enough dead insects to create a second plan. I revived the insect's plant-based wing cases where pollen and leaf fiber had fused to them. It was an absurdly technical interpretation of plant matter. The system accepted it. A cloud of tiny white shells flew ahead, triggering snap vines and revealing pressure roots without giving the dungeon enough harm to accelerate. Harper asked whether I could raise a person who had eaten a salad. I told her the question was offensive to both necromancy and salads. At the second gate, living tendrils formed a wall too thick to trick. Harper mixed 2 liquids and sprayed a narrow line across their tips. Frost formed. The last few inches of each tendril died. I touched one frozen tip. My power entered only the dead section and stopped at the living boundary. Pain cut up my arm, sharp and green, but the tip moved. It wrapped around the neighboring tendril. I took another dead tip, then another, until the entire wall was wrestling itself. The plants were still alive. I was commanding the parts Harper had precisely killed, using each vine's dead end as a handle against its living body. Partial burial appeared in my mind as if the skill had always been waiting for me to become rude enough to discover it. The feedback was brutal. Every living section fought my mana like an immune system. By the time we squeezed through, violet cracks covered my fingertips. Harper warned that using it on a larger target might cause my nerves to confuse life and death permanently. I promised to be careful, which fooled no one. Owen led us through the museum wing using the stump's memory. He marked dead wooden frames with silver runes, creating a trail that could not be redirected by the living maze. The displays held extinct seeds, preserved roots, and dried herbs whose names had vanished with the people who used them. The central case was empty. Between us and the case stood the conservatory's oldest guardian, a living tree braided from 12 species. Each trunk supported the others. Killing any section would push stored life into the rest, making the guardian larger. Silas had crossed by burning a pollen replica of himself and letting the tree chase its scent. We did not have his fire signature. Harper identified a dead fungal crust around one root. Fungus was not a plant, and Gravebloom ignored it. Beneath that crust, however, lay a belt of root tissue starved of air. Truly dead, still attached, and wrapped around the guardian like a weak seam. Partial burial entered the seam. Pain climbed both arms. The 12 living trunks pulled in different directions, trying to isolate the dead belt. I did not resist. I made the belt loosen. The guardian expected an attack. It did not expect its own structural knot to untie. Trunks separated. Sunlight reached species that had lived in shade for decades. Branches turned instinctively toward the light and opened a corridor between them. We walked through without killing a leaf. As the belt slipped free, I caught one final sensation from its death. Silas had applied black ash here years earlier in a dose too small to trigger alarms. He had been mapping dead boundaries inside living defenses long before I awakened. My power had not created his plan. It had merely become the first thing capable of seeing it. Silas stood on the other side holding the world tree fragment. It was no larger than his thumb, black and lifeless. He had reached it first, but it refused him. Black ash crawled over the fragment and fell away. When he saw me, he smiled and dropped it into the soil. Then he broke the growth seal above us. Green exploded through the museum. Vines thick as bridges smashed cases. Trees punched through the floor. The glass dome darkened beneath layers of leaves. Silas used his fire in careful lines, driving the growth toward us while leaving himself a path to the roof. I could not revive anything because nothing stayed dead. Every branch he burned was immediately consumed by fresh vines. Every leaf I raised disappeared under living roots. The dungeon was producing life faster than I could use its remains. The extinct seeds scattered from the broken cases. Most were too old even for the museum to identify. To me, their age was not silence, it was pressure. Each rotten seed remembered waiting for conditions that never returned. I poured mana into them. The floor became white, pale stems erupted from dead shells. These were not living plants restored to nature. They were botanical corpses repeating the shapes they had once tried to grow. One formed cups lined with silver hairs. Another spread flat leaves covered in holes. A third produced hollow roots that opened toward the flood of green mana. The extinct plants drank the growth spell. They had evolved in an age when wild mana storms could make forests expand a mile in a night. Their death memory included the instinct to survive that excess. Silas's accelerated growth flowed into them, and the living jungle slowed. I commanded the hollow roots to pull harder. The revived herbs swelled into bone-white towers. Leaves the size of shields unfolded. For one impossible minute, an extinct ecosystem stood inside the conservatory and treated a modern disaster like spring rain. Silas's smile disappeared. He changed tactics immediately. Instead of burning my plants, he ignited the museum's support beams. The dome began to collapse. Owen carved stability runes into dead display wood. Harper froze the base of 3 living trees, giving me dead handles. I raised those trunks against the falling glass while she guided trapped workers out through the path behind us. Silas could have attacked. He chose the world tree fragment instead. The growth wave had rolled it toward my feet, and the instant I touched it, the conservatory vanished from my senses. I saw roots crossing continents. I saw a forest cut out of space and folded behind a scar. I saw a tiny piece of heartwood buried beneath bone-white trees. The fragment melted over my right hand. Black wood formed a plate across my knuckles, lined with violet light. When falling glass struck it, the plate widened on instinct and shielded my face. It did not obey like my other plants. It remembered protecting something. Silas watched long enough to understand that the fragment had accepted me. Then he swept pollen from a living flower into a glass tube and escaped through the broken dome. He had not taken the fragment, but pollen inside the chamber had absorbed its memory map. He now knew where the vanished forest was hidden. We saved the conservatory by letting the extinct plants consume the last growth surge. At dawn, the pale herbs collapsed into seeds again. Harper collected them with hands that almost shook. Species the world had lost were sleeping in her case, dead but no longer gone. My new armor plate pointed west. Before we could follow, students across the academy began coughing black dust. Ash-colored veins appeared under their skin. Harper looked at the sample from the orchard and understood what Silas had done with his stolen time. The black ash was no longer just killing plants. It was learning how to grow inside people. The academy infirmary filled before noon. Ordinary antidotes slowed the fever for minutes. Then the ash rearranged itself and returned stronger. Harper studied it until a black line appeared beneath her thumbnail. She hid the infection for almost an hour, I noticed, because she stopped insulting my plans. By then the line had reached her wrist. The only known source of an antidote was an underground pharmacy dungeon abandoned after its poisonous ecosystem killed 3 expedition teams. That sounded discouraging until Owen found an older record. Long before the dungeon became toxic, it had preserved medicinal plants from the World Tree era. Those species were extinct. Extinct plants had become my specialty. We entered through a stone well behind the academy. Harper came because she was the only person capable of analyzing a cure. Owen came because I was no longer trusted to encounter ancient history without accidentally waking it. The dungeon air tasted sweet. That was the first warning. The floor was covered in dead roots, but unlike the orchard roots, these had killed everything around them before they died. Their memories were full of venom. I raised a narrow bridge of pale roots. The moment my boot touched it, thorns grew through the soul. Death memory did not make a poisonous plant safe. It made the plant remember exactly how it used poison when alive. Harper cut the thorn from my boot and collected the liquid. Her infected hand trembled. We had perhaps 3 hours before the ash reached her heart. The first chamber contained shelves of dried herbs. I revived them, but centuries of mixed fumes had tangled their memories. One herb produced a cooling sap, then released the toxin that had killed it. Another curled protectively around Harper's wrist and began draining her blood. We could not simply raise a magical cure and hope it behaved. The shelves began moving before we finished testing. Dead wooden cabinets unfolded from the walls, not under my command, but under an old pharmacy defense. Their drawers opened and fired preserved seeds like bullets. I raised a screen of poisonous roots. The seeds struck it, recognized compatible soil, and germinated into living thorns my power could not touch. The defense turned my shield into an enemy. Harper identified the seed coating as heat-sensitive. Owen carved heat runes onto dried labels, and I sent the labels fluttering through the chamber. The cabinets tracked the warmest objects and fired at them. Living thorns erupted wherever the labels landed, tangling the moving shelves together. That stopped the barrage, but it also filled the only exit with green growth. I used partial burial on the poisoned root shield. The newly living thorns had killed narrow strips of tissue where they penetrated it. I controlled those strips and made the shield roll, winding the thorn mass around itself like thread on a spool. Harper walked behind it, collecting rare venom from each species. Owen complained that every obstacle had become a supply cabinet for us. At the exit, the old defense presented 3 stone bowls. One required a medicine, one a poison, and one a substance that could be both. The records had decayed beyond reading. Harper's infection worsened while she examined them. Black veins reached her elbow. She could no longer feel 2 fingers. I touched the dead herbs scattered around the bowls and used root recall. Generations of pharmacists had handled them. Plants could not remember spoken instructions, but they remembered being placed. Cooling leaves always went left. Toxic seeds went right. The same pale root had been placed in every bowl depending on its preparation. We used that root for the third answer. Raw, it stopped the heart. Distilled through charcoal, it restarted damaged nerves. Harper gave me a look suggesting I should not become excited by lethal medicine, then opened the door. The dungeon had just taught us the central rule of the cure. The difference between poison and medicine was often separation, dose, and timing. I asked the roots beneath the shelves what they remembered absorbing. Heat, water, iron, poison, medicine, and ash answered as overlapping sensations. Plants separated substances every moment of their lives. Roots chose some minerals and rejected others. Leaves moved gases. Fruit concentrated sugar. If death memory could repeat motion, perhaps it could repeat selection. I revived 3 kinds of root and gave each one a different remembered task. The first pulled liquid from Harper's infected blood through a shallow cut. The second trapped the black ash. The third returned the cleaned blood through a second cut. It was the least comforting medical device ever created. A bone-white root loop crawled under Harper's skin while violet pulses moved through it. She watched the ash collect in a dead seed pod, and informed me that if she survived, she would make me regret the phrase, "This should work." The system named the technique funeral distillation. It slowed the infection but did not cure it. The ash was alive enough to learn. Each time my roots filtered one structure, the remaining particles changed shape. We descended into the greenhouse vault. Giant corpse flowers lay collapsed across the floor. Their petals had once been red, but time had turned them black. Nearby records described how they consumed toxic mana and transformed it into scent. I revived one. Its stalk rose higher than my head. Bone-white petals opened around a black throat, and the entire dungeon shook with a smell like honey poured over a grave. The flower leaned toward Harper's arm. I let it bite. Its roots did not enter her body. They entered the ash. The flower recognized the infection as food and pulled a cloud of black particles through her skin. Harper went pale. The corpse flower swelled. Then it screamed. A larva unfolded inside its throat. It had been too small for us to see. A demon curled inside the blight, and using every failed antidote as training. It tore through the flower, landed on the floor, and grew legs shaped from hardened ash. Owen trapped it inside a square of rune plates. The demon changed its body to slip between the lines. Harper sprayed acid. It hardened. I attacked with poisonous roots. It copied the filtering behavior and expelled the venom. Silas had designed a disease that became familiar with whatever tried to kill it. So I fed it something the world had forgotten. Among the museum seeds Harper carried was a flat gray shell from an extinct herb. She had identified it as a purifier because it drank excess mana in the conservatory. Its root memory told a different story. The species had gone extinct after the world cooled because it produced a defensive compound that required volcanic soil. Nothing alive had tasted that compound for 400 years. I revived the seed inside the corpse flower. The demon ate it instantly. It did not wait for the poison. The larva split into 6 smaller bodies, each carrying only part of its adaptive memory. One grew a shell against the strongest acid. One became transparent to the detection runes. One burrowed into the corpse flower. The others rushed the shelves where preserved samples from the academy waited. If even one escaped, the fever would return with 6 new defenses. I made the corpse flower bite through its own infected petal, trapping the burrowing larva in a ring of dead tissue. Harper altered her acid every second, her numb hand measuring colors while Owen called out the changes. I raised dried herb labels as tiny nets. The transparent larva passed through the first rune square but carried pollen from the extinct seed, so Owen marked the pollen instead of the demon. 2 larvae reached the blood samples. I used funeral distillation through the wooden rack, ordering its fibers to pull moisture from the sealed tubes. The blood thickened before the larvae could enter, while clean water burst through the corks and knocked them into poisonous roots. The final larva climbed my arm. Black ash entered the violet cracks left by partial burial. I felt Silas's spell search for the pattern of my mana. Instead of tearing it away, I let it sample 3 different revived herbs at once. One remembered freezing, one remembered drought, one remembered drowning. The larva adapted in conflicting directions, hardening, softening, and opening pores at the same time. That was when the extinct poison reached all 6 bodies through their shared memory. They turned transparent together. It adapted to the pale roots, the violet mana, and the flower's hunger. Then the seed released its ancient poison. The demon had no inherited answer. Its ash shell turned transparent. Harper threw one sealed vial into Owen's rune square, and the mixture vaporized the larva from the inside. Every infected particle in the academy had been linked to that larva. When it died, the ash stopped changing. I raised the corpse flowers again. They drew the stable poison from Harper, then from jars of blood sent down from the infirmary. Funeral distillation separated medicine from venom. By nightfall, Harper had produced enough antidote for every infected student. The academy that had laughed at my rotten bean now watched a procession of enormous dead flowers carry medicine from a poisoned dungeon. I expected applause. What I got was silence and people moving out of their way. That was better. The larva left behind a glassy shell. Before we could destroy it, a line of fire burned through the dungeon ceiling and pulled one piece into the darkness. Silas had collected a sample of my mana after watching it kill his creation. He was not repeating attacks. He was learning me. The cured roots twisted across the floor after he vanished. Their combined memory formed words in the soil. The forest is not gone. It is chained. The world tree fragment opened a spatial scar 3 days later. We crossed through with enough academy support to call it an expedition, though every experienced fighter stopped at the entrance. Sound disappeared beyond the scar. Birds would not fly over it. Light entered and came back gray. Harper, Owen, and I went anyway. The vanished forest stood exactly as the stump remembered it after the war. Millions of dead trees reached into a colorless sky. Their bark had faded white. Not one leaf moved. The ground was buried under ash that had never blown away. My grave bloom reacted so violently that I nearly razed the entire forest by accident. I felt roots beneath every direction. Trunks towered for miles. Fallen seeds filled the soil. Each plant carried a final moment, and those moments pressed against my mind like a crowd behind a locked door. I touched one sapling. Violet light moved through it. The trunk unfolded from the ground, shook ash from its branches, and stood on roots shaped like long legs. The instant it moved, something in the silence noticed us. Predators emerged between the trees. They had no bodies. They were gaps where sound should have been, outlines cut from the world. The first one passed through a dead trunk and erased the noise of its fall. The second opened a mouth, and Harper's warning vanished before reaching us. They were made from compressed silence, left by 5 centuries without life. I ordered the revived sapling to strike. Its branch passed through the nearest predator. Physical force meant nothing to an absence. Owen carved a rune into the sapling's trunk. The mark captured the tree's remembered sound: wind through needles, birds on bark, rain tapping branches. When the tree swung again, all those sounds exploded from the wood. The silence predator shattered. We advanced by reviving one narrow path at a time. Owen loaded trunks with ring memory, turning ancient forest noises into weapons. Harper scattered capsules that rang at different frequencies, revealing predators as ripples. I made dead branches clap, roots drum, and seed pods scream like kettles. The silence adapted to us. Smaller predators joined into a dome that absorbed every sound our trees released. Within seconds, the expedition became mute. Owen struck a rune plate and produced no vibration. Harper's capsules shattered without a chime. Even the noise inside my own throat disappeared. Sound had failed, so I used the memory that came before sound. Trees did not hear wind. They felt pressure bend branches, twist trunks, and pull roots. I linked those sensations through forest choir. When the silence dome moved, it displaced air without permitting noise. 1,000 dead twigs measured that invisible pressure. My forest army attacked the empty shape from all sides. Branches entered the dome and vanished from our senses, but their roots still remembered tension. I bent them until the predator's compressed boundaries stretched thin. Harper threw a frequency capsule into the center. The sound could not escape, so pressure built inside the dome. Owen carved one release rune on the nearest trunk. The trapped noise exploded inward. The dome collapsed into a dark bead. I caught it inside a hollow dead seed and sealed the shell with roots. A captured piece of absolute silence was far too dangerous to carry, which meant Harper immediately put it in her case. Later, that seed let us cross a field of hanging bone chimes that would have summoned every remaining predator. I revived the shell just enough to repeat the silence around us. For 30 steps, even our heartbeats vanished. The price was that the seed absorbed my command voice too. We emerged with half the army performing outdated instructions behind us and had to rebuild the choir from simple signals. For a forest that had been silent 500 years, We became extremely unpopular. The deeper we went, the more the death memory changed. Outer trees remembered fire. Inner trees remembered chains beneath the earth. Every root had been pulled toward one central point before it died, as if the forest itself had tried to hold something closed. I expanded my awareness across 100 trees. Instead of hearing each one separately, I gave them simple roles. The first row walked. The second row struck silence predators with stored sound. The third carried us in woven branches. The fourth listened through roots for disturbances. The commands passed from tree to tree like a song with only 4 notes. Forest choir awakened. My army did not march in straight lines. It reshaped the terrain. Fallen trunks stood up and became bridges. Root masses rolled boulders aside. Dead canopies interlocked over us as shields. When a predator approached, a dozen trees released 500-year-old thunder at once. It was ridiculous, loud, and powerful enough to make the gray sky tremble. Then black fire appeared along the horizon. Silas had planted ash charges throughout the forest before we arrived. He detonated them in sequence. The outer trees did not burn. They collapsed inward. Millions of tons of dead wood began falling toward the central path, a slow avalanche designed to crush us under the very army I could command. I tried to stop every tree. Their death struck me. Axes, flame, poison, starvation. The original forest's agony poured through forest choir. My knees hit the branch platform. I forgot which heartbeat was mine. For one moment, I was a million things dying at different speeds. Harper drove a stimulant needle through the bark plate on my hand. Owen slapped 3 blank rune plates against my chest, giving the memories somewhere else to spill. They could not carry the whole forest, but they gave me enough space to think. I had been trying to hold up the avalanche. That was impossible, so I taught it to walk. The first falling trunks turned sideways. The next layer landed across them. Roots hooked around branches. Thousands of dead trees interlocked as gravity pulled them down, building legs, walls, and a curved roof around us. Each piece received one simple command through forest choir: brace, lock, step. The avalanche became a fortress. It rose on 100 root columns and walked through its own collapse. Silence predators struck the walls and burst against stored forest noise. Ash charges exploded beneath us, but new trunks rolled into place. Harper stood at the front scattering frequency capsules while Owen carved steering runes into a branch the size of a ship's mast. We crossed 10 miles inside a moving mountain of dead wood. The fortress reached a ravine where the spatial scar had folded the same river over itself. Water fell upward on one side and down on the other. Our root legs stepped into the current and returned to where they began. Silas had turned the forest's geography into a loop. Owen studied tree rings from both banks. The left trees remembered sunrise from the east. The right trees remembered it from below. Their spatial memories disagreed because one side had been rotated when the forest was imprisoned. I raised fallen leaves and sent them into the river. Each leaf returned wet, but the water carried pollen from a different century. Harper separated the pollen by age. The newest grains marked the true downstream path. The older ones belonged to repeated copies inside the loop. Forest choir gave every root leg a different timing. Instead of the fortress entering as one object, the first leg stepped during the oldest current, the second during the next, and the rest followed the pollen sequence. From outside, our walking mountain stretched into a chain of overlapping versions. Inside, we crossed one ordinary bridge of roots. Halfway over, silence predators attacked the sections between moments. They cut 3 support trunks from history before those trunks could brace the roof. Owen's runes vanished with them. Part of the fortress began collapsing around gaps that had never existed seconds earlier. I opened root recall through the stump memory carried in my armor fragment. The ancient tree remembered the missing trunks because its roots had once touched their ancestors. I could not restore erased wood, but I could make neighboring branches repeat the pressure those trunks used to carry. The fortress leaned into empty memory and stayed upright. Harper threw the captured silent seed into the center of the loop. For one instant, the spatial fold lost the sound of its own moving water. The repeated river flattened. Our last root legs crossed. On the far bank, the vanished pollen formed a symbol in Harper's filter. The same root spiral hidden beneath city fountains. The imprisoned forest and the modern city shared one buried water network. Silas's eventual path was not toward a distant ruin. It led back beneath the people who believed the war had nothing to do with them. We stored that clue in Owen's deepest plate. If the forest erased us, the river memory could still warn the city. At the forest center, the fortress stopped. Every root beneath it had been cut. A circular pit opened through the ash. Ghostly shapes hung inside, caught in a web of black lines. Soldiers, animals, and creatures from the ancient forest had been stripped from their graves and stored as fuel. Silas's people were not raising the dead. They were harvesting the part of death that could remember fear. The walking fortress tried to kneel beside the pit and could not. Black lines connected to its root legs, searching for the fresh fear inside our plant memories. Every tree in the structure began reliving the moment it fell. Forest choir filled with the urge to collapse. I changed the command from stand to shelter. The fortress no longer resisted falling. Its roof opened, its walls curved, and its trunks lowered around the pit like a giant cage. Each collapsing piece passed its weight into another. Black lines expecting panic found the calm mechanical memory of beams settling into support. Harper sprayed neutralizer through hollow branches. Owen used the fortress's final shape as one enormous rune, marking the boundary of the soul web. When the last trunk touched the ground, thousands of trapped shapes stopped screaming and turned toward the center below. We had not freed them, but we had given their fear a wall. The fortress completed its rescue by becoming a shelter again, exactly as it had during the avalanche. At the bottom of the pit, a red seam pulsed beneath the world, the demon gate. The trees around us lit violet without my command. A voice entered through every trunk at once. It sounded old, tired, and amused that a human had turned its funeral into a vehicle. It called itself Rowan. Rowan had once been the spirit of this forest. When the world tree fell, the ash order tore Rowan's heart from its roots and scattered its mind across the dead wood. Silas had returned to finish the extraction. The voice asked me to dig beneath the pit before Silas arrived. If I recovered its heart, Rowan could show me how to bind the stolen souls. If Silas found it first, the forest would not be a prison anymore. It would become a key. The path beneath the pit was built to consume memory. We learned that when Harper turned around and asked why we had entered the forest, she remembered me, Owen, and the ash infection. The last hour was simply missing. Owen checked the rune plates strapped inside his coat. Their silver lines had gone blank from the edges inward. Rowan guided us through dead roots, but the maze moved whenever we understood it. Corridors folded behind us. Black moss absorbed our footprints, then died, leaving clean stone. Every wrong turn took something small at first. The taste of breakfast, a childhood song. The reason I disliked yellow gloves. Then it took the memory of awakening my power. I stared at a bone-white root under my hand, and did not know why it obeyed me. Harper struck my shoulder with the flat of her knife. Owen showed me a bark strip carved with 6 words. Ely commands dead plants, keep moving. We began writing ourselves onto dead wood. Harper carved the ash formula into a bracelet. Owen recorded our route across plates of bark tied from wrist to elbow. I wrote the names Harper, Owen, Silas, and Rowan on the inside of my world tree armor. Beneath them, I added one sentence. You chose to come here. The maze could steal memory, but it could not erase a mark from something already dead. That solved only half the problem. We could read what we had lost, but reading was not the same as feeling it. At the next junction, Owen's bracelet told him Harper was an ally. He believed the words and still raised a rune blade when she approached too quickly. We needed anchors strong enough to restore instinct. Harper uncorked scents from her belt. Bitter citrus marked danger. Cedar marked trust. Hot metal marked Silas. She soaked each odor into a different dead seed. I revived the seeds as tiny creatures that rode on our shoulders and released the correct scent whenever the maze stole a related memory. Owen used rhythm. He carved 3 knocks into my bark strip, 2 into Harper's, and 4 into his own. Whenever we met after a corridor shifted, we tapped the sequence before coming closer. I used plant memory. The dry vine around my wrist had learned the pressure of my pulse. If my thoughts changed enough that I stopped moving like myself, it tightened. Twice it pulled me away from corridors containing false scenes of the Academy Hall. Once it strangled my thumb because I briefly became convinced I was the examiner. The maze then created copies of our carved messages. Dead bark appeared along the walls telling us to separate, abandon Rowan, or trust Silas. The false instructions looked perfect. Owen found the flaw. His real carvings cut across tree rings, so the dead wood remembered the pressure of his hand in sequence. Counterfeit bark showed only marks. I used root recall on every instruction before believing it. Truth was not the sentence. Truth was the history of how it had been made. That lesson stayed with me long after the maze. A memory could be altered. A witness could be frightened. But an entire chain of material consequences was much harder to fake. Silas's guards found us at the first descent. They were golems made from compressed salt, shaped like headless people. Every step scattered grains through the root corridors. My necromancy threads broke on contact. The runes Owen cast slid from their surfaces. Harper's acids only turned the salt into heavier crystal. We retreated into a chamber full of cursed flowers. Their dry petals were covered in warnings carved by the ancient defenders. Anyone who inhaled their pollen would feel dead souls trying to enter their body. Harper sealed her mask. Owen raised his sleeve. I revived the flowers. Their petals opened with a sound like whispering teeth. The salt golems charged. I let them smash every flower. Powdered petals filled the room. Each fragment was still dead plant matter, but the salt broke my control whenever it touched, so I stopped trying to control the fragments directly. I revived the one thing they remembered doing without instruction, binding souls. The pollen clung to the empty spiritual pressure inside the golems. Violet threads appeared around their bodies. The salt could interrupt mana, but it could not interrupt its own hunger for a soul to command it. Every golem pulled the cursed pollen deeper, and the pollen tied them to one another. When the first golem raised its fist, all 6 copied the movement. They punched each other into a single useless pile. The technique spread into the roots below us. Grave vines emerged, pale and thin, following trails that living eyes could not see. Roots remembered every burial above them. They remembered the weight of bodies, the final mana leaking into soil, and the shape of souls passing through. For the first time, my necromancy touched something that had once been human. Not the corpse, not the ghost, only the botanical memory of where a soul had gone. Rowan warned me that following those trails too deeply would let the maze take something important. I followed anyway. The grave vines led toward the stolen forest souls and then curved beneath them. Rowan's heart rested in a chamber below the gate seam, wrapped in black roots. It looked like a wooden seed the size of my head, split down the center and glowing faint green. Silas stood beside it. He had arrived through another route and built his plan around our rescue. Black ash coated the floor. If I raised the dead roots, the ash would infect them. If Harper neutralized the ash, Silas would take the heart. If Owen recorded the confrontation, the maze would eat the plate. Silas touched the seed. A wave crossed the chamber. I forgot my parents' faces. I knew I had parents. I remembered hands lifting me, soup on a winter night, someone laughing when I planted a coin and waited for it to grow. But the faces at the center of those memories became smooth light. The maze offered a choice without words. Chase the stolen memory into one corridor, or take Rowan's heart before Silas could bind it. Silas expected me to choose the memory. He had learned that I valued people over victory. He had simply misunderstood what that meant. My parents had taught me to protect what remained. I did not need their faces to obey that lesson. I sent grave vines through the soul trails in the floor. They did not attack Silas. They wrapped around Rowan's heart and pulled it toward the millions of dead roots overhead. Silas burned the first vine. 100 burial memories supplied 100 more. Harper shattered neutralizer capsules across the ash. Owen carved the shape of Rowan's seed onto his own largest plate, so the maze would remember it had been there. I grabbed the heart with my armored hand. The chamber became a forest. Rowan's scattered identity rushed through me. Rain from lost centuries, animals sleeping between roots, children tying wishes to branches, fire, axes, the world tree falling. Then 500 years of silence. I could have commanded that spirit. For one instant, Rowan was dead plant memory inside my grasp. I let go. The heart sank into the root network by choice. Green light faded, replaced by bone-white bark and violet veins. Rowan returned as a voice distributed across every revived tree, able to guide us but too scattered to fight alone. Silas escaped when the chamber began collapsing. Again, he used our rescue priority as his opening. This time he left angry. He had not gained the heart, and he had lost the salt golems. But his black ash touched my grave vines during the struggle, learning how I followed souls. We left the maze with Rowan and without the memory of my parents' faces. Owen had carved 2 small portraits onto bark before the details vanished from my descriptions. They were crude. One nose was definitely too large. I kept them anyway. Rowan told us the ancient Ash Order had hidden 3 gate components after the war. Silas already possessed 2. The third had been built into the foundation of the Academy's victory arena, where generations of fear, ambition, and cheering crowds had charged it without knowing. The Academy tournament began the next day. Silas returned publicly as if nothing had happened. Our evidence showed ash, memories, and an ancient masked figure, but the clearest rune plate had been burned. He claimed someone had imitated his appearance. The Academy allowed him into the tournament while investigating. That suited him. It suited me too. The gate component was somewhere under the arena. We needed enough time on the field for Owen to locate its rune pressure. Winning the tournament would keep me there longest. Unfortunately, the arena had been rebuilt from living stone. There was no wood, paper, cloth, grass, or soil. Even the spectators sat on shaped crystal. The Academy designers had created a battlefield with nothing my class could revive. I carried a dead wooden staff through the entrance. The first opponent cut it in half before I finished raising it. The second shattered both halves. By the third match, the crowd was laughing again because I entered holding a bag of broken wood. I emptied the bag onto the stone. Sawdust spread around my boots. Every grain had once belonged to a branch. Each remembered bending toward light, carrying leaves, or shaking in wind. Those memories were weak alone. Together, they were a storm waiting for a direction. I revived the dust. Control nearly escaped me. Sawdust did not share roots or fibers anymore. 10,000 grains moved in 10,000 directions, and a single broad command produced only a pale explosion around my face. I remembered forest choir. Complex instructions had overwhelmed the vanished forest, but simple roles could scale. I divided the dust into 5 currents. Lift, circle, gather, scatter, strike. Each grain followed only one behavior, passing position through collisions with the others. The useless cloud became a system. Silas tested it from the spectator passage. A hidden flame ignited one current. I scattered that group and sent the circling grains through the rising heat. They rode the air instead of fighting it, then gathered inside the arena lights. When the flame vanished, a white sawdust figure dropped behind my opponent, from a direction neither of us had expected. The technique taught me another rule. The less memory plant matter retained, the less it could improvise, but the faster it accepted a clean command. Dust was not a tiny tree army. It was a language made from motion. A brown cloud became bone white and rose around the arena. My opponent fired blades through it. The dust separated, flowed around each attack, and assembled behind him into the shape of a tree. When he turned, the false tree collapsed into a wave that swept his feet away. I called the technique Dust Dominion. The crowd stopped laughing when the sawdust formed a giant hand and flicked the opponent out of bounds. The semi-final introduced a different problem. My opponent filled the arena with water, soaking the sawdust until every grain clumped to the floor. He expected me to reshape it. I let it sink. Wet dead wood carried mana better than air. I spread one command across the entire puddle, then made the swollen grains remember the tree's old capillary pull. Water climbed through the sawdust in twisting columns. Each column carried a false image of me on its surface. The opponent attacked reflections while I lay flat inside the shallow water, breathing through a hollow reed from my bag. When he stepped near, the sawdust absorbed water beneath one foot and released it beneath the other. He performed a split so dramatic that the judges ended the match out of sympathy. Silas replaced the arena water with living moss before the final. He had watched Dust Dominion fail when plant particles became part of a living system. Each match was not merely competition. It was another experiment measuring the boundary of my class. In the next match, I shaped it into wings that carried me over a shockwave, then into dozens of false bodies, then into a drill that entered a crack in the living stone and expanded beneath my opponent's platform. I was not overpowering anyone. I was bringing one bag of garbage into a clean arena and making cleanliness their problem. Owen watched from the preparation tunnel, marking each pulse from below. Harper entered as an alchemy competitor and deliberately covered the arena's air vents with harmless colored vapor. The vapor revealed a spiral current descending beneath the center platform. The gate component was directly under the final match. Silas withdrew before facing me. He arranged for the Academy's highest-ranked champion to take his place. The champion wore no stereotypical heavy armor and carried no shield. He moved like a dancer, with demon-enhanced muscles and thin blades of force around his hands. The instant the match began, living moss erupted over every surface. Silas had seeded it beneath the stone. My sawdust struck the green layer and lost shape as the moss drank my necrotic mana. The champion crossed the arena in one step and drove a force blade through my shoulder. I fell. The crowd screamed. The moss spread over my spilled blood, feeding on the mana inside it. That was what Silas had learned from the conservatory. Living growth could consume my commands before dead matter moved. He had also learned from the ash larva that my mana carried a repeatable signature. The moss had been engineered to prefer it. I pushed more mana into the floor. The moss fed faster. Harper understood first. She covered a laugh with one hand. Owen kept carving beneath the stands. The champion assumed I was panicking. He kicked away my sawdust bag and prepared the final strike. Green moss climbed his boots, drinking every violet thread I sent toward it. The force blade struck my bark plate again. A crack crossed the world tree fragment, and the moss immediately grew toward the exposed violet light. It climbed my arm, trying to connect my mana core to Silas's hidden sigil below. I could have cut it away. Instead, I used partial burial on the small sections dying from contact with the fragment. Dead fibers twisted inside the living moss, creating channels. I pushed mana through those channels so efficiently that the rest of the moss fed faster. The champion thought he was interrupting my final attack. Every strike drove more of the green network against my armor. Harper's colored vapor above the vents turned violet. revealing that my mana had reached the spiral beneath the arena. Owen used the current to map the gate component. Silas had designed the moss to steal my power, and I turned it into a wire carrying our investigation through his own defenses. I gave it everything. The moss glowed. It swelled. Its cells overloaded with necrotic mana, turned gray, and died. All at once, the entire arena became mine. I raised the moss inside the champion's boots. Bone-white fibers locked his ankles. Dead strands climbed the demon-enhanced muscles and interrupted their movement. He cut the surface away, but the moss under his feet pulled him flat. My sawdust returned. It formed a huge pale tree above the arena, not because I needed it, but because after weeks of being mocked I deserved one dramatic entrance. Its branches caught the force blades. Its roots lifted the champion gently out of bounds. I won. At the same moment, Owen drove his rune tool into the tunnel floor. A silver projection rose above the stands, showing the surviving memory from the orchard, the stolen plate in the grove, and Silas planting black ash beneath the arena. Every spectator saw his face. Silas stood in the highest passage and applauded. He did not deny it. He pressed one hand to the wall. The crowd's fear, anger, and outrage poured into lines hidden beneath the seats. The whole tournament had been a charging ritual. Our public exposure supplied the final emotional surge. The arena split open. Red light rose from the demon grave. Thousands of spectators slid toward the widening cracks. Silas dropped into the center willingly, smiling up at me as the gate component descended beneath him. He had sacrificed his reputation because he no longer needed it. Then the first demons began climbing toward the crowd. I had one perfect chance to follow Silas into the grave. I watched it disappear beneath a falling section of arena while a family clung to the edge above me. Silas had predicted my choice. I made it anyway. Dead moss raced across the living stone. It formed nets under the first rows of spectators and caught them as the stands tilted. My sawdust became ropes, but there was not enough. The arena contained almost no other dead plant matter. Then I remembered the tournament decorations. Every entrance was covered in victory wreaths. Vendors had paper cartons, wooden signs, and cloth made from plant fiber. Spectators carried carved noisemakers. Beneath the crystal seats ran old timber supports left from the previous arena. To everyone else, it was trash and decoration. To me, it was an emergency forest. I raised the wreaths first. Hundreds of dead flowers tore from the walls and unfolded beneath falling people like parachutes. Paper cartons became white birds that pulled children away from cracks. Timber supports ripped through the crystal, interlocked across broken sections, and formed evacuation bridges. One entire bridge failed when a gate pulse turned its center to ash. 60 people dropped toward the demon grave. I sent the victory wreaths after them, but the flowers could carry only children. Adults continued falling. The old arena roof had been lined with pressed cork to soften impacts. I tore it down in blocks, revived the dead bark, and ordered each piece to remember floating on water. There was no water beneath the crowd, only rising demonic mana. But the cork's behavior gave it lift against the current. A field of white platforms caught the falling spectators and bobbed above the red light. Demons climbed onto the platforms from below. I could not overturn them without dropping the people. Harper sprayed a bitter compound across the human side of each block. Owen marked the demon side with attraction runes. Then I revived the cork's memory of swelling. Each platform curled around its demon like a seed pod, while leaving the bitter side open. People jumped to the bridges. The sealed pods fell back into the grave and collided with the next wave climbing up. At the eastern stands, living ornamental trees remained green because their roots had not touched the gate. I could not command them, but the dead timber houses beneath the seats could. I raised the supports as careful arms and moved the planters onto stable ground. Saving those few living trees cost valuable seconds. Harper did not question it. We were fighting so life could remain, not so my army could become larger. Owen ran along one bridge carving arrows into the wood. Each rune lit only when the next section was safe. Harper threw bright vapor through the exits, so frightened spectators could see breathable paths through the dust. The western exit jammed when living stone bent around its doors. 300 people crowded the passage. Pushing from behind made the seal tighter. I sent paper birds through ventilation gaps to inspect the outer wall. Their wings felt air pressure and returned with a map folded into their creases. The living stone had no dead surface, but wooden handrails ran through it as reinforcement. I revived the rails and made them remember shrinking during dry winters. They contracted inside the wall, opening hairline cracks. Sawdust flowed into those cracks, gathered behind the stone, and formed wedges. When the rails expanded again, the wedges multiplied their force. The doorway opened without breaking the load-bearing arch. The crowd surged. Owen's wooden arrows climbed the walls and flashed in sequence, turning panic into separate lines. Harper changed the vapor color from blue to gold whenever a group needed to stop. We did not have time to explain. The dead decorations became a language everyone could follow at a glance. That pattern spread across the arena. Wreaths marked children, paper birds marked injuries, walking benches carried anyone unable to run. Spectators handed me wooden jewelry, paper tickets, and cloth scarves to add to the system. The same people who once saw dead plants as useless were searching their pockets for pieces of an army. The first demon reached the field. It had 4 arms, no eyes, and a mouth across its chest. Dead moss wrapped its legs. The creature bent down and ate the moss. Its body grew larger. More demons climbed behind it. They ate my sawdust, the wreaths, and even the timber bridges whenever they came close. Dead plant matter carried stored mana, and demonic bodies consumed that mana like meat. My entire class had become their lunch. I sent false sawdust bodies in one direction while moving civilians in another. The demons learned after the 3rd decoy. They ignored shapes without souls and rushed the crowded bridges. I changed what the decoys carried. Grave vines reached into the battlefield memories stored beneath the arena and gathered the faint trails of ancient souls without binding them. I threaded those trails through sawdust figures like scent through cloth. The demons turned instantly. Each false body now smelled spiritually alive. I made them run badly on purpose, stumbling and looking back like frightened civilians. The demons chased with such confidence that they entered a circle of dead moss. Owen closed the circle with 1 rune, and Harper ignited the black ash residue inside them. The demons were not burned. Their own stolen essence became visible, giving the corpse flower seeds a target before they opened. That trick had a cost. Borrowed soul trails carried emotion. My sawdust decoys became too convincing because I felt the ancient fear guiding them. For several seconds I ran with a body that did not exist while my real body stood beside a widening crack. The dry vine around my wrist tightened and pulled me back. Every scale increase demanded an anchor. Mine was becoming a piece of ivy everyone else would have swept away. Harper opened her extinct seed case. She held up 1 black seed from the poison root dungeon and reminded me what the corpse flowers had eaten. Toxic mana. Demonic essence was the purest toxin in the grave. I drove the seeds into cracks around the arena and poured grave bloom through the dead moss network. 8 pale stalks erupted from the stone. They grew past the highest seats, petals unfolding like enormous hands. Their throats were black pits lined with violet hairs. The demons stopped charging. For the first time, something in our world looked hungrier than they did. The corpse flowers bent down and swallowed them whole. 1 demon clawed through a petal. The torn pieces became smaller mouths. Another released fire, and the flower inhaled the flames with the demon attached. The largest creature tried to retreat into the grave. 3 root bundles caught it, dragged it across the arena and fed it to a flower that had begun tapping impatiently against the wall. The crowd forgot to flee because everyone was watching my garden eat an invasion. Then 1 corpse flower swallowed a demon carrying a gate crystal. Red light burst through its veins, the flower's mouth rotated toward the surface, and demonic symbols appeared along its petals. Silas was trying to claim my revived plant from the inside. I cut the flower from forest choir before the corruption spread. That left 1 enormous predator uncontrolled in the center of an evacuation route. Harper identified the crystal as a spiritual stomach. Anything the flower consumed would now feed the gate instead of the flower. Owen could not carve a rune on the moving petals. Direct grave vines would give Silas a path back into the choir. I covered the corrupted flower in sawdust. It snapped at the cloud and inhaled every grain. Inside its throat, the dust formed a false root network isolated from mine. The gate crystal attached to that network, believing it had found forest choir. I made the dust scatter. The crystal's claims split across 10,000 grains with no shared identity. Red symbols flickered. Harper threw the captured silence seed into the open mouth for 1 second. Cut off from Silas's next pulse, the crystal became spiritually dead. Grave vines seized it. I made the flower spit the crystal back into the grave. A demon below caught it and was immediately attacked by its own allies. The gate's attempt to corrupt my garden became a fight inside its army. I shouted at them to keep moving. Within minutes, the last visible demon disappeared. The corpse flowers turned toward the evacuation bridges. Their hunger remained. Soul trails glowed inside every human through the plant's cursed pollen. 8 giant mouths leaned toward thousands of survivors. I had revived their appetite, but appetite did not understand the difference between evil and available. Grave vines rose from the dead roots below the arena. I wrapped them around the flower's spiritual senses and pulled those senses downward, toward the demon grave. Owen carved target runes into the timber bridges, separating human soul patterns from demonic ones. Harper released the scent of the black ash larva, giving the flowers something familiar to hunt. The garden lunged into the pit. The largest flower became lodged across the opening. Demons attacked from below, feeding it faster than its dead stem could carry the energy. Its petals expanded over the arena and began forming smaller mouths wherever demon claws cut it. Soon those mouths snapped at anything that moved, including rescue bridges. I could not simply cancel Grave Bloom. The flower contained enough stolen demon essence to remain animated for minutes, and releasing it would remove the grave vines controlling its spiritual aim. Harper created a chain of scent capsules leading toward the central crack. Owen carved a repeating target rune along the flower's own stem. I took control of the dead pollen inside its throat, and made the pollen imitate human soul trails behind us, then vanish one by one toward the grave. The hungry mouths followed the disappearing scent. The whole flower twisted away from the crowd and drove itself deeper into the pit. Its roots wrapped the underside of the arena, becoming a safety net beneath the remaining stands. The monster I had created became part of the rescue structure. That mattered. Raw power was never enough. Anything dangerous I raised needed a second purpose once its first target disappeared. Roots and stems followed, creating a ring around the opening. Any demon that climbed was caught before it reached the surface. I could not close the gate, but I had turned it into a feeding bowl. The last spectators escaped. My shoulder wound soaked through my uniform. The bark armor had spread to cover it, but every movement sent pain down my arm. Silas was already gone. Rowan spoke through one timber bridge. 3 seals lay between the arena and the central demon grave. Silas had crossed the first while we rescued the crowd. He had not merely expected my decision. He had used the exact time required to save everyone as part of his route. I could not beat him by becoming less human. I had to make protecting people advance my plan too. One corpse flower coughed. A demon boot fell onto the field, followed by a black shard of bark. The shard had been lodged inside the creature for centuries. When I touched it, the world tree fragment on my hand reacted. The bark remembered furnaces beneath the eastern mountains. It remembered forests ground into powder, burned, and mixed with demon blood. Silas's order had operated an ash foundry there since before the academy existed. That foundry produced the blight. Destroying it would slow every plan Silas had left. We followed the memory map through a drainage tunnel beneath the grave. Harper sealed my shoulder with hardening resin, which was not healing and felt like being repaired by a carpenter. Owen packed the most important rune plates into a dead wooden case so I could move it if the tunnels collapsed. The drainage tunnel crossed the first deep seal Silas had opened. Red light seeped through roots arranged like a locked wheel. We could not restore the seal without all 3 components, but leaving it open would let smaller demons follow us toward the foundry. I revived the wheel. It remembered turning closed, yet half its plant fibers had been replaced by demon bone and rejected grave bloom. Harper coated the bone with plant resin mixed from the arena wreaths. The coating was dead and obeyed, but it tore whenever the wheel moved. Owen carved repeating runes across separate resin patches. I rotated them one after another like hands passing a rope. Each patch pulled only an inch before tearing. Dust Dominion carried the fragments forward and Harper hardened them again. The seal closed through hundreds of tiny failures, rather than one complete movement. As it turned, grave vines pulled trapped soul trails out of the mechanism. The souls did not become soldiers, they passed on. Their final pressure left a map of the lower tunnels inside nearby roots, revealing that Silas had diverted every demon away from the eastern mountain. The foundry would be defended by people and engineered plants instead. Silas understood that demons were food for my corpse flowers now. He had changed armies. The sealed wheel could hold for 1 day. A timer written in cracking resin traveled with us through forest choir. Protecting the arena had created a deadline for the foundry assault and ensured the demons could not attack our backs. Behind us, the corpse flowers guarded the arena. Ahead, smoke moved through cracks in the earth. For the first time since awakening, no one tried to stop me at the academy gate. The instructors who had pitied me stood aside. Students who had laughed helped carry extinct seeds to Harper's transport. The examiner returned my original dry vine, preserved in a small glass tube after the goblin attack. Its pale tip still pointed underground. I wrapped it around my wrist. The vine had been my first weapon, my first clue, and the first dead thing that trusted my command. It was thin enough to overlook. That made it valuable. We reached the eastern mountain before dawn. The ash foundry lay inside a mining cavern surrounded by fire vents. Chimneys released black smoke into a sky with no birds. Wagon lines carried dead lumber through a guarded entrance. We spent 1 hour watching the supply pattern. Every 7th wagon carried wood from the dying city. Grave Bloom let me sample the logs through fallen sawdust. Their memories contained kitchens, furniture workshops, and city parks. Silas was not merely cutting forests. His foundry was consuming the places people lived, so the blight carried emotional residue. Owen wanted one intact shipment record. Harper wanted samples from each furnace line. I wanted Rowan's heart if it was inside. Entering for 3 separate objectives was dangerous, but achieving only one would leave Silas another route. We tied the goals together. Owen's runes would ride my ash through the foundry and record wherever particles traveled. Harper's catalyst would mark every chemical line the ash touched. Rowan's heart would react to world tree residue in the same particles. One smoke network could investigate, sabotage, and search. The plan depended on learning to command ash, which I had never done. I looked at the chimneys and decided the foundry could teach me from inside. Harper's plan involved chemistry, timing, and a 90% chance of not exploding. My plan involved pretending to be cargo. We hollowed one pile of logs, climbed inside, and let the foundry take us through the gate. I spread dust dominion through the sawdust around our bodies, making the shipment sound solid when guards struck it. Owen carved silence runes into the inner wood. Harper held 3 unstable acids against my face and whispered that sneezing would be an act of betrayal. The wagon stopped twice before the foundry. At the first station, masked guards drove a living probe vine through every log to search for hidden mana. I could not control the vine, and killing it would trigger an alarm. I used partial burial on the tunnel the probe had already bored through the dead lumber. Fibers around the hole moved just enough to guide the living tip in a circle around our bodies. The vine emerged from the far side, believing it had crossed solid wood. At the second station, workers dusted the shipment with salt. My sawdust disguise froze. One guard struck the pile and heard the hollow space above Owen's head. Harper released a drop of acid into the wood. It killed a fresh layer of fibers around us, creating a new unsalted surface. I transferred the command there while Owen carved a vibration rune that replayed the sound of a solid trunk. The next strike produced a convincing thud. Once the wagon moved, we discovered the salt had cut our exit route. Harper could dissolve it, but the reaction would fill our hiding space with gas. I revived the wooden wagon bed and ordered it to remember warping under summer heat. One plank opened a gap beneath us. We crawled along the axle while the log pile entered the furnace intake without passengers. Our disguise burned 30 seconds later, which was precisely long enough to place us inside the foundry, and precisely too short to find a safe way out. The wagon rolled into heat. The foundry was larger than the academy. Furnaces lined a central chasm. Workers in ash masks fed whole trees into grinders, then mixed the powder with red vapor rising from below. Pipes carried liquid blight toward sealed tanks. At the far end, Rowan's heart pulsed on a map table. The seed should have been safe inside the vanished forest. The moment Rowan spoke through the arena timber, Silas had followed that connection backward. He had not taken the whole spirit. He had extracted the central heart while Rowan's attention was divided among the rescue bridges. That was the cost of using Rowan at scale. Silas stood beside the heart and looked directly at our wagon. The logs burst into flame. We escaped through the bottom as the disguise collapsed. I raised burning splinters, but Silas's new fire reduced them to powder before they moved. I sent dead roots through the floor. Heat vents turned them to ash. Corpse flower seeds opened, only to dry and crumble in the furnace air. Silas had built a battlefield where every plant died twice, once into wood, then again into structureless ash. He thought the second death belonged to no one. Ash had almost no memory. Each particle remembered being wood, but the identity was broken across fire. A trunk knew how it stood. A vine knew how it clung. Ash remembered only heat, rising, and the direction of the last wind. That was enough. I reached through the furnace smoke with grave bloom. One black particle turned white, then 10, then 1,000,000. Violet sparks filled the foundry chimneys. The smoke reversed and descended in human shapes. Silas burned the nearest figure, but fire only created more ash. I sent 3 false bodies running toward Rowan's heart, and spread the rest through the machinery. Ashen rebirth awakened. My control was fast because there was almost nothing to command. No roots, no branches, no complex death memory. Each particle had one instruction: move. Together, they became blades against exposed gears, curtains across mask lenses, and abrasive storms inside pipe joints. The foundry had one defense against smoke: cyclone vents designed to pull airborne ash into sealed pits. Metal shutters opened, and half my army vanished down the shafts. I followed through the particles and discovered the pits were filled with salt water. Commands broke the instant ash touched the surface. Silas had prepared a grave for the remains of his own weapons. Harper redirected one chemical line into the nearest pit. The liquid blight reacted with salt water and formed floating crystals. Owen threw a rune plate into the shaft, marking the rhythm of the cyclone. I could not revive the submerged ash, but the crystals had trapped dry particles inside their cores. I pulsed Grave Bloom between vent cycles. Millions of tiny ash pockets moved together, carrying the crystals like shells. They climbed the cyclone in reverse and burst from every vent as a storm of black and white needles. Silas raised fire. The crystals melted, releasing ash on the far side of his barrier. My cloud reassembled behind him and shaped itself into Rowan's face. He turned toward the image despite knowing it was false. That moment of anger gave Harper enough time to reach the feed line, and Owen enough time to place his first evidence plate. Ash had weak memory, but it borrowed meaning from whoever looked at it. I made workers see guards, guards see intruders, and Silas see the spirit he had failed to capture cleanly. The foundry began fighting its own smoke while we moved through the confusion. Harper reached the chemical feed lines. She poured a clear catalyst into the first pipe, then used the foundry's own pumps to distribute it. Owen placed rune plates beneath the storage tanks, recording the entire process and every marked shipment. Silas did not chase them. He watched me command the smoke and changed his plan. He shattered the cavern roof. Cold air rushed through. My ash storm rose toward the opening by its final natural memory. For 3 seconds, I lost control of half the cloud. Silas crossed those 3 seconds and struck the world tree plate on my hand with a blade of black flame. The armor held, but the impact drove me across the floor. He lifted Rowan's heart from the map. I sent the dry vine from my wrist. It slipped beneath his flame and looped around the seed. He caught it between 2 fingers. He recognized the first technique I had ever used. He called it sentimental. Then he told me why he had chosen the ash. His hometown had stood over one of the ancient seals. When the seal weakened, the world tree's remaining defenders did not evacuate the people. They sacrificed the whole town, turning every life into enough spiritual pressure to keep the grave closed. Silas survived because the ash gardener found him beneath a dead roof and offered him a different answer. The world had buried his family to protect everyone else, then erased the event from every history. He did not want to rule the demons. He wanted to destroy the root network that allowed one generation to feed another into forgotten seals. If the demon grave opened during that destruction, he considered it an honest disaster rather than a hidden one. For the first time, I understood his anger. Then I looked around the foundry where he had turned infected students, trapped souls, and entire forests into fuel. Pain explained him. It did not excuse him. I released the dry vine before he burned it. It fell into the ash at his feet, overlooked again. Silas drove black fire through my smoke figures. I stopped rebuilding them and pushed every particle into the furnace mouths. Ash clogged the vents, pressure climbed. Harper's catalyst reached the liquid blight and crystallized it inside the pipes. Owen's runes flashed, forcing emergency valves to close instead of open. The foundry began choking on everything it had burned. Emergency constructs rose from the chasm. They were shaped from iron cages packed with living thorn cores. I could not control the green centers, and my ash passed through the cage bars without slowing them. Each construct carried a nozzle that sprayed salt mist. Harper could kill the thorns, but then they would become mine only after the iron cage had crushed us. Owen could seal 1 nozzle, not 12. I sent ash into the living cores and let the thorns consume it. Silas expected the same mana overload trick from the arena. He ordered the constructs to purge before the plants died. This time the ash was not fuel. It was a mold. Each particle coated the wet inner surface of a thorn. When the construct purged, my cloud emerged carrying a complete map of every living stem and iron joint. Owen carved 1 shared rune from that map. Harper sprayed acid only where the thorn tips touched the cage hinges. Tiny plant sections died at those boundaries. Partial burial took them. I did not control the whole core. I made 12 dead joints twist. The living thorns pulled in the opposite direction and tore their own cages open. Freed from iron, they followed the foundry's heat lamps like ordinary plants and wrapped around the ceiling pipes. The defense dismantled itself without giving me another permanent soldier. Silas had adapted to my previous victory. We answered by using the same rule for a different purpose. Silas protected Rowan's heart rather than stabilizing the furnaces. That choice told me the heart mattered more than the factory. I sent ash through cracks in the map table and tried to lift the seed. He wrapped it in black roots that reacted to my mana signature. The sample stolen from the larva had taught his blight to bite my commands. Rowan cried through every dead log in the cavern. I could save the heart or pull Harper and Owen away from the exploding tanks. Silas already knew which I would choose. This time, I built the rescue into the attack. My ash cloud formed a tunnel around Harper and Owen, carrying heat past them toward the roof. At the same moment, every clogged furnace released pressure downward. The floor split beneath Silas. He had to use Rowan's black roots as a bridge, exposing their connection to the foundry pipes. Harper triggered her catalyst. Crystal raced backward through the roots and coated Rowan's heart. It did not free the seed, but it slowed the corruption. Owen's plates captured the black root pattern. We lost Rowan, yet gained the exact structure Silas was using to control it. Then the storage tanks exploded. Ash lifted us through the roof in a spinning column. The foundry collapsed into its own chasm. Every shipment record, prisoner route, and ash formula burned. But Owen's dead wooden case flew beside us, carrying rune copies of them all. We landed on the mountain as black smoke turned bone white above the ruins. Silas emerged on the opposite ridge holding Rowan's heart. He had sacrificed the foundry to keep it. Black roots entered the seed from his arm. The ground answered. Far below us, the dead world tree network woke under his command. A pulse traveled west. Living grass grayed. Mountain pines dropped their needles. The blight spread through roots faster than any animal could run. Silas no longer needed tanks. He had connected the disease directly to the world. We raced back toward the city inside an ash cloud. Dust Dominion could carry us only in short leaps, so I raised dead fence posts, abandoned wagons, and fallen trees in sequence. Each object threw the next forward. Harper described it as the worst transportation system ever invented. Owen was too busy being sick over the side of a flying door to disagree. The city was dying when we arrived. The first district had not evacuated because a living hedge maze surrounded its shelter. The blight killed the outer leaves but left the inner stems green, creating a wall that was half mine and half untouchable. People were trapped inside while ash rain thickened. I controlled the dead outer shell with partial burial. The living core resisted every turn. Harper identified where black veins had already stopped sap flow, marking sections only seconds from death. Owen drew a root across dead paper and laid it over the hedge like a stencil. We moved one segment at a time. Harper chilled a marked joint just as the blight killed it. I revived that joint before the living stem collapsed and bent it outward. The hedge became a sequence of doors opening at the exact moment each section died. Silas accelerated the blight to ruin our timing. Entire walls grayed together. I sent rotten beans along the ground as moving markers. Each bean stopped beneath a root when it felt the final loss of pressure. Paper arrows above and bean markers below gave me a three-dimensional map of death crossing the maze. We opened a tunnel through the center. The survivors emerged carrying potted living herbs under their coats. They had risked their lives for plants that could not fight or filter poison yet. Harper moved those pots to the mobile vaults. That small rescue kept the city from becoming only a collection of things I could command. Somewhere inside the catastrophe, green still existed because ordinary people had carried it. Every tree browned from the roots upward. Gardens collapsed. Food stores rotted. Worse, the blight entered the water through living reeds and roots. People crowded the stone districts, but most buildings were filled with wooden beams, paper, cloth, and stored grain waiting to become infected. I faced the cruelest possible timing problem. My power could save a tree only after the tree was dead. Before that moment, Gravebloom did nothing. Silas exploited that gap with false deaths. The blight forced trees into a dormant state so complete that my skill almost recognized them. When I poured mana in, the living cells consumed it and carried the ash deeper. 3 rescue trees blackened because I acted too early. I stopped trusting silence. Harper sampled sap for active enzymes. Owen marked heat patterns on dead paper. I listened for death memory, which appeared only when a plant had a past it could no longer change. One plaza, 50 trees fell silent together. Enzymes stopped. Heat vanished. Every test said dead. Gravebloom still hesitated. I cut one fallen twig. The inside bent rather than snapped. The trees had linked their last living cells through root grafts and hidden the shared pulse underground. Silas wanted me to infect that pulse with my mana. I refused to raise them. Instead, dead street paper folded into insulating blankets around the trunks, while Harper neutralized the surface ash. Hours later, one green bud opened. The people nearby cheered more loudly for that single living bud than for a whole marching forest. I understood why. My power could make loss useful, but usefulness was not the same as recovery. I stood beside an ancient street tree as its last green leaf shook. People begged me to help. I pressed my hand to the bark and felt no answer. Then the leaf fell. The tree died. Violet light surged through my hand. I raised the trunk before it hit the street. Its roots pulled free, shaped themselves into 4 legs, and carried a group of children away from the infected water. Across the city, I waited for deaths measured in seconds. A market awning died and became a stretcher. Stored beans rotted, then rose as crawling filters that absorbed ash from a cellar. Fallen street trees linked hollow trunks into pumping towers, drawing clean water from stone reservoirs, untouched by roots. The northern district created a worse disaster. The blight killed roots holding an old hillside together. Mud began sliding toward hundreds of homes. Raising the dead trees upright would not restore the living root tension that had stabilized the soil. I used the houses. Dead timber beams walked out of buildings already evacuated. They arranged themselves across the slope as ribs. Fallen trees lay between them. Paper from the city archive folded into thousands of tubes and carried Harper's fast-setting resin into the deepest cracks. The mud struck our structure. Every beam remembered supporting weight from above, not from the side. They began snapping. I changed their orientation inside Forest Choir. Owen's map pages marked pressure zones. Beams in the first row bent and passed force into the second. Hollow trunks drank water from the mud and pumped it into empty canals. Rotten seed filters trapped blight so the runoff would not infect the lower district. The landslide stopped one street from the shelters. People emerged to find their empty homes standing on the hillside without walls because I had borrowed the skeletons. No one complained. They helped Harper coat the structure and turned my emergency forest into a permanent terrace. Saving the district created a new problem. Every raised beam carried domestic memories. Smoke from kitchens, children marking height on doorframes, winter creaks and arguments behind walls crowded my mind. Death memory was not limited to a plant's biological life. Dead wood continued recording pressure, heat, and damage after becoming an object. The city was full of witnesses. One witness exposed a hidden attack. A dead library shelf remembered being moved every midnight even though the building was sealed. I followed its pressure memory to a tunnel under the archive. Silas's roots had been using printed maps to learn evacuation routes, touching the plant fibers without disturbing the ink. I raised every discarded draft map in the building. They folded into false streets, bridges, and shelter symbols. Owen copied convincing rune signatures onto them. We fed the decoys into the tunnel while keeping the real routes on metal plates Harper carried. Silas redirected his next root strike toward an empty warehouse shown as our central shelter. The attack broke through the floor and found thousands of rotten seeds waiting inside. I revived the seeds as clamps around the black roots. Harper flooded the warehouse with distillation vapor. Owen sealed the exits on his map rune. When Silas tried to withdraw, the paper decoys wrapped his roots and transferred false route memories backward through the network. For the next hour, attacks erupted beneath abandoned fountains, closed streets, and the canal section we had already drained. That hour allowed the last real shelter to evacuate. The scheme also revealed something unsettling. Silas could read dead plant memories through Rowan's heart almost as well as I could. Every witness I awakened could become a spy if I left it connected. From then on, Owen placed a closing rune on each memory after use. The city taught us to treat information as another battlefield. Owen began sorting those echoes into rune channels. Structural memories went to my commands. Human traces went into sealed plates so I would not invade lives accidentally. That boundary became as important as the difference between protection and ownership. Having access to buried memory did not give me the right to expose all of it. Harper organized mobile seed vaults from metal carts. She saved living samples before the blight reached them, not because I could command them, but because a world full of obedient corpses was still a dead world. Owen used dead paper from abandoned shops as moving maps. Sheets folded into arrows and flew ahead of evacuation groups, changing direction whenever his rune network found a safe route. An entire row of old timber houses began to collapse. I revived their beams before they struck the ground. Walls lifted, foundations unfolded, and 12 houses walked out of the infected district with families still inside. People stared through their windows as wooden legs stepped over the canal. That was the day the city stopped calling my power useless forever. Silas attacked through the water at sunset. Soul-bound roots erupted from every fountain. They were already dead and already commanded. When I touched one, black mana threw me backward. Rowan's stolen heart gave Silas authority over the World Tree Network, and his claim reached the roots before mine. The roots wrapped evacuation towers and dragged them toward the canal. Grave vines could see the stolen souls inside, but any attempt to bind them tightened Silas's grip. Dust Dominion clogged the water and slowed them for seconds. Corpse flower seeds refused to open because the roots carried Rowan's spiritual scent. One soul-bound root lifted a whole bridge and used it as a club. I raised the dead wooden deck, but Silas controlled the roots woven through its underside. The bridge fought itself above a crowd. Harper threw resin capsules at the joints. I assumed she wanted to stiffen them. Instead, the resin isolated sections of root from one another. Owen marked each isolated segment with the memory pattern captured at the foundry. Silas's command arrived in one pulse. Because of the resin gaps, different sections received it at different times. The root twisted left, right, and upward simultaneously. The bridge dropped, but my revived deck unfolded into a spiral and lowered the crowd like a wooden ramp. I used Dust Dominion to carry fragments of the ancient stump's memory into every isolated root. Each particle showed one image of the Ash Gardener killing the first forest. The commanded roots hesitated. That hesitation revealed the older layer beneath Silas's ownership and gave me the opening for counter-burial. I could not overpower the first forest spirit in its own network, so I listened to the root beneath Silas's command. Current ownership was only the newest layer. Below it lay the root's real death memory. Black ash entering its cells, Rowan screaming, Silas forcing it to move. I used root recall not to project the memory, but to make the root experience it again. The dead root recognized Silas as the cause of its death. His command snapped. Counter-burial spread through the canal. I did not claim the roots. I reminded each one how it had been buried, and let it reject the hand that killed it. Black lines turned violet. The roots released the towers, rose from the water, and coiled around the blight flowing behind them. Silas sent more. I freed those too. Soon every attack added another strand to the barrier around the city. We survived the night, but victory opened my mind to the entire region. Millions of plants died together, grass under moonlight, orchards planted by grandparents, forests no one had named, tiny roots holding hillsides in place. I heard each final moment through forest choir. Their grief had no language, which made it worse. My memories loosened. I called Harper by the wrong name. I forgot which hands were mine. The dead army waiting around the city was vast enough to defeat Silas. It was also vast enough to erase me. Rowan's faint voice traveled through the freed canal roots. Silas could not silence every part of the spirit at once. Rowan told me not to push the grief away. Grief was memory refusing burial. Beneath the old battlefield, the first stump guarded something designed to carry that weight. Armor made from the dead world tree. Silas was moving toward the demon grave. We had one chance to reach the armor before he opened it. Behind us, the city stood inside a ring of bone-white trees. Ahead, every remaining green thing began to turn gray. The ancient battlefield remembered defeat more clearly than victory. When we returned, the revived stump opened a path beneath its roots. Stone steps spiraled into the place where the World Tree's defenders had made their last stand. Every wall was packed with dead roots. Their memories pressed against my thoughts until I could no longer tell whether I was walking down or falling through 5 centuries. Silas's blight followed us into the passage. Black veins crossed the ceiling faster than we descended. I revived the root walls to close behind us, but each barrier joined his infected network seconds later. Harper mixed the last extinct poison with resin and painted a thin line down the center of the stairs. Owen placed memory plates at intervals along it. I divided the retreating roots into 2 groups. One carried structural commands. The other carried false memories of our position. When Silas seized the first barrier, he saw us 10 steps behind where we stood. His roots attacked the image and broke the stair section beneath it. We crossed the gap on a bridge made from Owen's wooden case. At the next barrier, the false memory showed us taking the left spiral. We went right while black roots flooded the wrong chamber. The technique was dangerous because I had to experience each false position before planting it. By the 4th barrier, I remembered being crushed twice and burned once. The World Tree armor fragment on my hand started covering my fingers, trying to protect me from events that had never happened. Owen marked false memories with a broken circle. Harper tied a bitter seed beneath my tongue. Whenever I tasted it, I knew the pain belonged to a decoy. We reached the armor chamber while Silas remained 3 lies behind us. For once, we had used his habit of reading my plants against him. Root recall did not only expose history. With enough care, it could create bait inside someone else's investigation. Owen fastened rune plates across my coat. One held my awakening, one held the orchard rescue, one held the first time Harper laughed at my sawdust hand. 2 small bark portraits held the faces I had lost, imperfect but precious. He told me that if I forgot myself, he would read me back in order. Harper carried a vial of clear poison. She had a plan, which was unfair after everything she had said about mine. The armor rested inside a chamber shaped like an open seed. Black plates of heartwood covered a seated figure with no body inside. Roots connected the plates to carvings of the ancient battle. When I approached, the chamber forced the stump's full memory into me. 3 dead guardians stepped from the carvings. They were not soldiers. They were suits woven from ancient roots, each carrying one rule left by the defenders. The first attacked anything touched by black ash. Trace contamination remained in the violet cracks on my fingers. It drove a spear through my coat before Harper sprayed funeral distillation catalyst across my arm, pulling the ash into a dead leaf. I revived the leaf and sent it past the guardian. The suit chased the contamination instead of me and buried its spear in the wall. The second attacked anyone carrying stolen memory. Owen's rune plates contained exactly that. He refused to destroy them. I raised the wooden case and made every plate orbit the chamber separately. The Guardian could not decide which witness was the thief. It split its root body among the targets until each strand became thin enough for Owen to pin with one recording rune. The third Guardian attacked the person with the strongest claim over the forest. Inside the chamber, it chose me. Every revived tree I commanded had added weight to my claim. Good intentions did not change the shape of control. The Guardian forced me to release Forest Choir completely. The dead army outside collapsed. City pumps stopped. Shelter houses froze mid-step. For 10 seconds, I possessed nothing. The Guardian lowered its weapon. I rebuilt the choir as a request carried through roots rather than one absolute grip. Simple emergency rolls answered first. Pump, brace, shelter, guard. Other plants remained still. The network became smaller but cleaner, and the Guardian opened the seed chamber. The armor was testing whether I could put down power before giving me more. I became the defenders. I felt them cut the world tree's roots while demons climbed from the red seam. I felt their leader put on the armor and try to command Rowan directly. The spirit resisted. The delay broke their formation. The defenders chose to sacrifice nearby settlements to power the seal, convincing themselves there was no other way. Their secret became Silas's wound 5 centuries later. The armor did not merely remember protection, it remembered failure caused by ownership. I touched the breastplate. Nothing happened. I was alive, and the dead world tree did not recognize living hands as part of its buried network. The fragment on my hand opened a narrow connection, but not enough to move the armor. Harper raised the clear vial. Her poison would stop my heart for less than 4 seconds. It would not heal me, strengthen me, or guarantee that I returned. It would make my body cross the boundary my power understood. I drank it before Owen finished objecting. Cold entered my throat. My heart stopped. For 4 seconds, Gravebloom saw me as something the world had tried to bury. My awareness left my body and entered every dead plant touching the chamber. I felt Harper catch me through the linen of her sleeves. I felt Owen drop a wooden rune tool. I felt the dry vine tighten around a wrist that no longer had a pulse. The armor showed me possible commands. One would raise every corpse beneath the battlefield indirectly by using the plants inside their graves. I rejected it. Another would drain Rowan's scattered spirit into the plates. I rejected that too. A third would root my dead body into the world tree and make me an immortal center of Forest Choir. For one breath, that offer felt peaceful. No confusion, no grief, no fear of losing another memory. I would become a perfect system and never choose badly again. Then Harper shouted my name. The sound did not reach my ears. It entered through the dead cotton fibers in her sleeve and traveled along her grip. Owen struck the floor with his wooden tool. Its vibration carried the rhythm he had assigned to me in the memory maze. 3 knocks. Ely. I rejected immortality because it had no room for anyone else's hand on the plan. The chamber exploded with violet light. Every armor plate lifted. Black wood wrapped my chest, shoulders, arms, and legs. Roots entered the space between my memories. I felt the deaths of forests across the region, but now the armor stood between each voice and my name. My heart did not restart. 4 seconds became 5. Harper struck my chest with a charged catalyst. Owen shouted something I heard through layers of soil. The world tree armor tightened, perhaps mistaking my stillness for acceptance. The dry vine around my wrist moved on its own. It remembered clinging to me in the academy hall. It tightened across my chest exactly where my heart lay. The tiny pressure guided the armor inward. Black plates compressed once. My heart beat. Air returned like fire. I collapsed on my hands while Harper explained, very calmly, that she would poison me again if I ever drank unknown liquids without permission. Owen added a rune to his plate that probably translated to idiot. The armor stood with me. Silas reached the outer chamber at that moment. Black roots pierced the seed walls and released a copy of the ash larva built from my stolen mana signature. It looked like a violet version of my own Gravebloom network, designed to make the armor identify Silas as another rightful wearer. The larva touched one shoulder plate. Half the armor turned black. I could not overpower a creature speaking with my mana. I opened the plate's sensory channel instead. The armor replayed the exact moment the larva's sample had been taken inside the poison dungeon. It felt Silas's fire pull the shell away. It felt my mana resisting inside it. Counterburial was not limited to roots. Anything commanded through a stolen identity could remember the theft. The shoulder plate rejected the larva. Black wood snapped shut around it. Harper injected extinct poison through a seam, while Owen carved the original mana sequence from his dungeon record over the false one. The larva hardened, softened, and opened pores at once, the same conflicting adaptation that had killed its first form. I raised its plant ash shell after it died. The shell ran back through Silas's roots carrying a false signal that the armor had accepted him. For several minutes, his blight stopped attacking us and began clearing a path for its expected master. We used that path to bring the real armor to the stump. It did not feel like a weapon. It felt like a forest placing itself between a storm and a seed. When I opened Forest Choir, the region's death memory flowed into the plates and emerged as organized signals. I could hear millions of plants without reliving every death. The armor gave grief roots, branches, and distance. I tested one step and heard a forest 100 miles away. The armor sorted its death into layers: present structure, usable behavior, sensory memory, and spiritual residue. What had once struck as one wave became 4 channels I could open separately. With structure alone, I raised a fallen tree without learning how it died. With behavior, I made it bend and anchor. With sensory memory, I saw the blight passing underground. I left the spiritual channel closed until Owen attached a rune plate as a safety valve. Harper tested my humanity with questions. My name, her role, the first thing I raised, why I had chosen Rowan's heart over my stolen memory. Each answer made the bark retreat a fraction. Then she asked what I would do after winning. I had no answer. The armor tightened immediately. A tool with no imagined future was too similar to a corpse. I forced myself to picture an orchard with living fruit, extinct herbs growing under careful glass, and dead guardians resting because nothing needed them. The plates loosened. That became the final limitation of the armor. It could carry death only while I remained pointed toward life. If I used it for domination alone, it would complete the transformation and preserve me as another obedient piece of heartwood. There was a price. Bark spread from the plates into my skin. Each time I expanded the choir, another patch of my arm hardened. If I commanded the whole world for too long, the armor might protect my mind by turning the rest of me into a tree. The chamber presented one final demand. Rowan's heart still belonged to the dead world tree. The armor offered complete power if I used Grave Bloom to command Rowan as a corpse. I refused. Instead, I revived the armor's own memory of protecting Rowan. The plates changed shape. Roots that had been preparing to enter my spine curved outward. The empty helmet split into a crown of branches, leaving my face uncovered. The world tree did not accept me as its owner. It accepted the same job I had chosen since the orchard: protect what remained. The battlefield shook. Silas had reached the arena grave below the academy and connected all 3 gate components. The red seam opened across the chamber floor. Through it, I saw him standing on a platform of black roots with Rowan's heart bound above him. Demons crowded behind a barrier thin as skin. He expected us to race through the obvious path. Harper examined the black root pattern Owen had captured at the foundry and found a flaw. Silas's control traveled outward from Rowan in pulses. Between pulses, the World Tree Network briefly listened for the spirit's own command. We used the battlefield stump as a drum. Silas sensed the preparation and sent blight roots through the chamber. They avoided my armor and struck Owen's rune plates, targeting the external memories that kept me human. One portrait of my parents split down the center. I caught both halves with the dry vine. The guardian roots offered to chase the attack, but that would reveal our pulse route. Harper coated the plates with poison that reacted only to Silas's ash signature. Owen arranged them in a false line leading toward an empty root chamber. When the next attack came, it followed the memories. The poison crystallized around the black roots. I used root recall through those crystals and sent Silas a false sensation of the armor moving east. He redirected the demon grave's defenses toward an empty forest. That gave us one unobstructed pulse through the stump. Owen carved amplification runes around its oldest ring. Harper injected funeral distillation catalyst into the root, separating Silas's ash signal from Rowan's natural mana. I struck the stump through Forest Choir. One pulse crossed the world. Silas answered with a pulse of his own. In the city, freed roots turned black again. At the arena, corpse flowers closed their mouths around the rescue tunnels. The vanished forest fortress began walking toward the demon grave under his command. I could block one region completely or weaken all 3 attacks. The old armor urged concentration. Protection meant choosing what mattered most. I chose coordination instead. Harper sent different chemical scents through the network. Bitter citrus woke the city roots from false ownership. Demon nectar redirected the corpse flowers toward the gate. Owen struck the stump in the walking rhythm of Forest Choir, reminding the vanished fortress of its original rescue command. I did not overpower any attack. I gave each local system the clue it needed to resist. The city roots used counter-burial. Grave vines leashed the flowers. The fortress remembered carrying us away from Silas's collapse and turned sideways, becoming a wall across his route. The armor shifted again. Plates that had covered my back moved to my forearms, as if recognizing that distributed protection did not require one invulnerable center. For less than a second, every dead tree stood upright, their roots pulled toward the demon grave. Fallen forests became bridges. City houses lowered themselves so residents could escape. Grave vines tightened around stolen souls. The corpse flowers at the arena opened their mouths toward the red seam. Then Silas took control again and released absolute blight. Until then, the disease had traveled through connected roots. This version fell from the sky as gray rain. Living leaves blackened the instant it touched. Seed vaults corroded. Moss vanished from stone. Harper watched her carefully preserved specimens die inside sealed metal carts. Across the horizon, green disappeared. Silas spoke through Rowan's stolen heart. He believed he had solved me. No living plant would survive until dawn. Nothing could regrow. My extinct corpses might fight for hours, but after that the world would contain only ash and demons. He was so certain that he let us hear him laugh. Harper looked at me. Owen looked at the dead seed vault. Rowan's voice had almost vanished.
Sorry, ma.
I looked at a world where every plant was becoming dead. For the first time, Silas had created a battlefield with no shortage of weapons. The limitation everyone laughed at was about to cover the planet. I lowered my hands. Instead of stopping the blight, I let the last forests die.
Sorry, ma.
Silas expected me to spend everything preserving isolated patches of green. The old defenders would have done that. They had protected symbols while sacrificing people no one would remember. I waited. One by one, the remaining lives beneath the blight went silent. The last leaf fell in the academy garden. The last grain stalk bent outside the city. Harper's extinct seeds cracked inside their vault and turned gray. For one terrible breath, the world contained no living plant I could hear. Then I used Grave Bloom. The planet answered. The first response came from places I had never seen. A desert where buried forests had become coal pushed black roots through the sand. A frozen valley raised flowers preserved under ice since before modern classes existed. Shipwrecks groaned as dead wooden hulls unfolded on the ocean floor. Ancient paper sealed in tombs fluttered without opening, careful not to reveal the words it protected. The scale should have made control impossible. Instead, the World Tree armor used the roles I had learned from sawdust: lift, brace, filter, bind, carry, remember. Every piece of dead plant matter accepted one simple verb. Local root memories chose the details. A forest did not need me to tell each branch where to stand. I told it to shelter, and its death memory supplied the shape of a canopy. A ruined house did not need instructions for every beam. I told it to carry, and centuries of bearing families gave it a posture. Silas tried to overload the network with contradictory terrain. He triggered landslides where dead roots rose, broke dams where timber moved, and opened salt reservoirs beneath old forests. The choir responded locally. Desert roots became nets under sand. Shipwreck planks sealed broken gates from the waterside. Paper swarms mapped salt boundaries and guided routes around them. For the first time, my power was larger than my imagination because I was no longer forcing every answer to begin inside my head. That frightened the armor. Bark closed over one ear. It tried to simplify me into the seventh command: remember. Owen struck the plates on my chest in a human rhythm. Harper poured a drop of bitter citrus onto the dry vine. Rowan whispered through the stump that partnership was not the same as surrender. I kept one part of the choir reserved for useless things. Wilted flowers danced on empty windowsills. Paper birds circled the academy tower. Orchard apples rolled into a smile no one had time to see. Those actions served no battle plan. They proved there was still a person inside the system capable of wasting power on joy. The bark stopped below my eye. Bone-white light erupted across every horizon. Dead forests rose together. Roots under cities, deserts, oceans, and mountains lit with violet veins. Ash clouds stopped above the foundry ruins. Rotten seeds opened in abandoned fields. Paper lifted from desks. Timber buildings flexed. Every grave decorated with a wilted flower became part of the same enormous network. My first attempt at forest choir had nearly erased me with a few million trees. Now I reached billions. The dead world tree armor closed around my body. Bark spread up my neck. Owen's rune plates ignited one after another, reading my memories back to me faster than the dead could bury them. I was Eli. I had awakened necromancy that could not raise a single bone. I had been laughed at by an entire hall. I commanded everything that hall had thrown away. Harper pressed both hands against the armor and poured her remaining catalyst into its roots. Funeral distillation traveled through the global network. Every revived plant repeated the oldest act of roots and leaves: take one substance, reject another. The dead world began filtering its own poison. Funeral distillation met obstacles no single herb memory could solve. The blight had fused with fresh water in one region, volcanic gas in another, and living animal blood near the city. I built chains of dead species, each performing one separation. Reeds pulled ash from water. Poison roots trapped the ash and released clean minerals. Corpse flowers drew demonic residue from the roots. Extinct cup herbs concentrated that residue into black nectar. Rotten seeds sealed the nectar and crawled toward empty stone quarries. Harper conducted the sequence through chemical scent. She released different vapors into the stump network, and each plant remembered a different season. Winter meant stop. Spring meant pull. Summer meant release. Autumn meant seal. The world became an alchemical machine with weather as its control language. Silas contaminated one chain with salt. Commands vanished across a whole coastline. Owen carved the missing sequence into dead paper, and wind carried physical instructions beyond the broken mana path. Local trees read the pressure of those paper impacts through their bark and restarted the filter without a direct command from me. Silas had spent years studying how to interrupt necromancy. He had never imagined dead plants communicating without their necromancer. Black ash lifted from soil in thin streams. Extinct herbs that had survived volcanic mana remembered how to separate blight from water. Corpse flowers opened outside every gate scar and drew demonic essence from the air. Hollow street trees pumped clean reservoirs. Rotten seeds crawled into cracks and trapped ash inside their shells. Silas forced Rowan's heart to reverse the network. Black commands struck my choir. Counter-burial met them. I showed every root the memory of its real killer. Silas's authority shattered branch by branch because the world knew exactly who had murdered it. He opened the demon grave completely. The academy arena disappeared beneath a red column. Demons rose in layers, climbing over one another. Some were winged shadows, others wore towers of bone taken from older worlds. At their center moved a shape too large for the gate, pressing a horned face against the opening. I sent the bone-white forests forward. They did not march toward the academy. Their roots pulled the academy toward them. Dead timber under the city formed rails. The broken arena lifted onto thousands of root legs and slid away from populated districts. Demons expecting to enter a city emerged inside an empty plain, surrounded by trees that had spent 500 years remembering war. The first rank of forest bent like bows. Owen's runes relayed one simple command through every trunk: release. Branches launched millions of hardened seeds. They struck demon wings, joints, mouths, and eyes. Each seed burst into soul-binding pollen. Grave vines followed the spiritual trails and pinned demons to the earth, not by their bodies, but by the shadows trying to retreat into the gate. The demons changed formation. Winged creatures lifted bone towers into the air, staying beyond the roots. Others cut away their own shadows and continued moving without spiritual trails. One enormous crawler spread salt from sacks along its back, opening a dead zone through my forest. I used extinct herbs from the conservatory. Their hollow roots had once drunk wild mana storms. Bone-white vines launched upward, not at the winged creatures, but at the red energy holding the towers in the air. They drank the lift spell. Towers fell into waiting corpse flowers. The shadowless demons reached our first line. Grave vines could not bind what they had severed, so Owen projected false soul patterns onto sawdust bodies behind them. Their abandoned shadows chased the strongest nearby scent and attached to the decoys. I moved those bodies into the forest, dragging the demons backward through their own spiritual connection. The salt crawler crushed every root in its path. I sent no roots. Ash from the foundry crossed above it as a white storm, entered the salt sacks, and coated each grain with dead plant dust. The creature released its next wave and unknowingly spread my army. Dust dominions shaped the salted ash into grinding wheels around its joints. When it collapsed, rotten apples rolled under its shell and burst into enough mold to mark every weak point for the seed launchers. Each enemy demanded a different combination. No technique won twice in the same form. The battlefield became a conversation between everything Silas had learned about me and everything I had learned because he tried to stop me. Corpse flowers rose behind the vines. The arena flowers had once nearly eaten the crowd. Now the entire grave supplied their hunger. Pale mouths large enough to swallow buildings closed over demon ranks. When demonic fire burned their petals, ashen rebirth carried the remains into the next creature's lungs. Flowers became ash, ash became claws. Claws drove demons back into flowers. Silas adapted. He stopped attacking my plants and attacked the armor carrying my mind. Rowan's stolen heart sent every unfiltered death memory toward me at once. The world tree plates cracked. I felt every forest fall again. Bark crossed my jaw. My legs rooted into the battlefield. If the armor completed its protection, I would survive as a tree and lose the ability to choose. Harper could not reach me through the storm. Owen's plates began breaking. Silas appeared across the field on a bridge of black roots, surrounded by flame that consumed ash before I could raise it. He told me I had proven his point. The world only united after everything living was sacrificed. Silas sent the memory of his destroyed hometown through Rowan's heart. I saw streets under gray rain, and people pounding on a sealed barrier, while ancient defenders stood outside. A child hid beneath a roof made from dead cedar. The ash gardener entered as warm smoke, and promised that forgotten pain could become power. Silas had carried that moment alone for most of his life. The memory was not false. That made it his strongest weapon. I did not argue that the sacrifice had been necessary. I used the stump to show him the decision from below. The defenders had possessed another option: divide the seal across many willing forests, and accept generations of visible hardship. The ash gardener had hidden that root pattern, then amplified their panic until mass sacrifice looked like the only answer. The same parasite had created the cruel choice that recruited Silas. He saw it and attacked harder. Accepting manipulation felt like betraying the people whose pain had shaped him. Black commands hit the armor. My parents' carved portraits cracked again. For one moment, I wanted to crush his soul simply to make the pressure stop. The armor began forming a closed helmet. I released my claim over Silas before the wood covered my face. He remained responsible for his choices. I did not need to own his punishment, his memory, or his future. The helmet opened. The dry vine moved. I almost believed him. Then the dry vine tightened around my wrist. It did not carry a grand memory. It remembered frost, clinging to a graduation arch, restraining one goblin, and pressing against my stopped heart. Its death was small. Its purpose had always been whatever I gave it next. I withdrew my mind from the largest trees and followed that tiny memory instead. The vine connected to its original root under the Academy Hall. That root connected to the old orchard. The orchard connected to the sealed grove. The grove connected to the battlefield stump. A single botanical path linked my first victory to the oldest truth Silas had tried to burn. I sent the vine underground. Silas watched the forests and corpse flowers. He watched my armor. He watched the ash clouds. He did not watch one dry strand moving through a crack in his root bridge. The vine reached Rowan's heart. It did not try to steal the seed. It wrapped around one black control root and remembered clinging. I activated partial burial. The root segment touching Rowan had died under Harper's crystallizing catalyst at the foundry. The rest remained animated by Silas's soul-bound mana. I controlled only that dead boundary, and made Silas's own root wrestle itself. His connection skipped one pulse. Rowan spoke. The forest spirit did not ask me to command it. It asked for room. I gave Rowan the entire choir. Green light appeared inside the bone-white world. Not living growth, not yet, but memory choosing a future. Rowan pulled its heart away from Silas and divided the seed into millions of sparks. Each spark traveled to one dead forest. Silas severed the root bridge and fell toward the gate. Black flame formed wings behind him. He reached for the ash gardener spirit fused to his soul and ordered the blight to consume Rowan's sparks. That revealed the spirit. Grave vines saw its trail. The ash gardener was not Silas. It was an ancient parasitic will bound to soot from the first world tree fire. It had lived inside generations of angry survivors, turning justified grief into hunger. Silas had chosen it, but its roots were separate from his human soul. I could have bound both. Instead, I used funeral distillation on a necromancer. Extinct roots rose around Silas, each remembering how to separate poison from medicine. Grave vines held his soul in place. Corpse flower pollen identified the demonic portion. The dry vine tightened around the boundary. I pulled. The ash gardener came out screaming. It fought separation by changing shape. First it became the faceless figure from the ancient battle. Then it wore Silas's younger face. Then mine. Each shape carried a different argument. The defenders were monsters. Silas was only a victim. I would eventually bury people for the greater good too. Funeral distillation did not judge arguments. It followed material history. Harper traced the parasite's compounds through the black roots. Owen traced its memory discontinuities through the rune plates. Rowan traced the places where the spirit's voice had interrupted its own. I traced the first moment plant ash entered a human soul. 4 different paths marked the same boundary. Extinct roots tightened along it. The ash gardener tried to jump into me through gravebloom. The world tree bark on my skin died another microscopic death under its heat, then revived and carried the attack away into the global choir. Billions of plants shared one fragment each. No single mind received enough corruption to take root. The spirit discovered the weakness of fighting a forest. A tree could burn. A forest turned fire into the beginning of something else. It took the shape of a burning figure made from every forest it had killed. Silas dropped onto the root bridge, suddenly human, suddenly powerless, and completely horrified by the thing that had been whispering through his anger for years. The spirit tried to enter the demon grave. The ancient stump stood from the battlefield. For 500 years, it had remembered failing to hold the first ash gardener. Now the entire world tree armor flowed from my body into its roots. The stump became a hand of black heartwood. It caught the spirit above the red seam. I closed my fist, the same way I had when the dry vine restrained a goblin. Every grave vine tightened. The ash gardener folded into a single black seed. I buried it inside the stump's oldest ring, where root recall would force it to experience every death it had caused whenever it tried to wake. The demon gate remained open. Without the spirit, Silas could no longer control it, but the horned creature on the other side had pushed one arm through. Its hand covered half the battlefield. Bone towers grew from its knuckles. It grabbed a corpse flower and crushed it. My armor was gone into the stump. Rowan was divided. The global choir had begun to weaken as purified plants exhausted their death memory. Silas lay near the gate. I could rescue him or use the last of my mana to close it. He expected me to choose him. That was the cruel pattern he had learned. So I made the rescue close the gate. I raised the dead root bridge beneath his body and threw him toward Harper and Owen. The bridge continued upward after releasing him. Every timber rail, paper bird, orchard ladder, conservatory seed, poison root, arena wreath, foundry ash particle, and city tree joined through forest choir. All the ridiculous things I had commanded formed one enormous structure around the demon's arm. Not a soldier, a vine. The whole dead world remembered how to cling. It wrapped the demon's wrist, climbed its arm, and anchored into the far side of the gate. The creature pulled back. That was what I wanted. The vine tightened as it retreated, dragging the three gate components out of alignment. Owen drove his final rune plate into the arena floor. The plate contained the stump's memory of the original sealing pattern. Harper poured the last distilled blight into the red seam. The toxin attacked demonic mana while leaving the dead plant structure untouched. Rowan's million sparks struck the roots at once. The gate collapsed. The collapse did not happen cleanly. 3 pieces of the red seam broke loose and raced through the root network, searching for new places to open. One entered the city water. One struck the vanished forest. One traveled down the dry vine toward my heart. Harper diverted the water shard into a chain of corpse flowers, each swallowing only enough demonic essence to avoid losing control. Owen trapped the forest shard inside the captured seed of silence, where a gate could not hear the world it was trying to reach. I let the final shard reach my armor. It opened a hole no wider than a needle. Through it, the horned creature saw me. Its will pressed against mine with the weight of another world. I pushed one rotten beam through the opening. The first kind of seed I had ever revived crawled into the demon realm, dragging a single grave vine behind it. The vine tied itself around the far side of the seam. When I cancelled Grave Bloom, the beam collapsed and pulled the knot shut from beyond our world. The smallest, least impressive thing my class could raise sealed the final crack. The horned arm vanished. Red light folded into a thread and snapped. Demons trapped on our side tried to scatter, but the corpse flowers had recovered their appetite. The last invader disappeared beneath bone-white petals just as dawn reached the battlefield. Silence followed. Then Owen's surviving rune plates activated above every city. During the battle, I had connected root recall to the global choir. The world saw what the stump had shown us. The 500-year war, the sacrifice settlements, the ash gardener, Silas planting blight, and the choices that opened the grave. No official could erase it again because the memory was now held inside every piece of paper, timber, and dead root that had joined the network. Silas woke beneath Harper's restraints. Without the ash gardener, his black fire was gone. He did not ask forgiveness. He stared at the projected memory of his town and finally saw that the parasite had been present there too, feeding on the defenders' fear and guiding their worst choice. His pain remained real. So did every crime he committed with it. The surviving academy guards took him away. This time there was no convenient escape, no hidden fire route, and no spirit inside him to burn evidence. The plates Owen carried held the foundry records. The samples Harper kept proved the blight design. Thousands of rescued witnesses had watched the arena open. Silas stopped once beside the orchard root memory projected over the field. He admitted nothing, but he asked Owen to preserve the complete record of his town without removing the parts that made the defenders look afraid. Owen agreed. Truth that protected only heroes would become another kind of burial. The guards carried Silas through a corridor of pale roots. None struck him. Counter-burial had freed them from his claim, and I refused to replace it with mine. They simply remembered the way to the holding cells better than any human map. I did not need revenge. I had something more frightening than revenge, evidence that could remember itself. The world was still botanically dead. Before releasing the choir, we spent 7 days preventing the victory from becoming another disaster. Dead roots held mountains until new supports could be built. Corpse flowers removed the last demonic contamination, but had to be rotated before hunger changed targets. Shipwreck wood carried food across harbors, while living crops remained unavailable. Paper birds searched ruins by feeling air move around survivors. Every success tempted people to ask why dead plants should ever sleep again. Obedient forest did not need water. Pale grain did not spoil. Walking houses could move away from storms. The Academy suggested keeping the global choir as permanent infrastructure. I took them to the vanished forest and opened its death memory, without filtering the pain. Convenience built on endless command was still a grave. The bone-white trees deserved rest, or a chance to choose Rowan's sparks. The world needed living systems that could surprise us, resist us, and continue after I was gone. We kept only structures that answered willingly through Rowan or had no viable living future. The rest would be released. Rowan's sparks waited inside the pale forests. I could have kept them that way. With Gravebloom, every tree would obey. No drought, fire, or axe could surprise them again. A bone-white forest army across the planet would make me more powerful than any awakened fighter in history. But I had learned the difference between protection and ownership. Harper opened one metal seed vault. The seeds inside were dead, but funeral distillation had removed the blight. Rowan asked what I wanted the forests to become. I released my command. Most revived plants settled gently into the earth. Their violet light faded. Where Rowan's sparks found cells capable of starting again, green appeared along bone-white bark. Extinct herbs remained pale because their old world no longer existed, so Harper gathered their seeds and promised to build them a place that did. Corpse flowers returned to sleep around the sealed grave. Grave vines stayed beneath cemeteries as quiet guardians, no longer pulling at souls. The vanished forest unfolded from its spatial prison. Its trees stood white beneath a blue sky for the first time in 5 centuries. Some would never live again. They did not need to. Rowan moved through them freely, carrying memory without chains. The World Tree armor left dark bark across my right arm and part of my chest. I could still feel distant dead roots when rain touched them. I never recovered the faces of my parents. The carved portraits Owen made remained imperfect. Harper continued insisting that one nose was too large. I kept both portraits beside the glass tube that once held my first vine. The Academy rebuilt the Awakening Hall around the old route instead of removing it. New students came to watch me raise extinct flowers, walking houses, and a tree stump that corrected history instructors by throwing acorns at them. No one called me the weakest necromancer anymore. They tried much more dramatic titles: Lord of the Pale Forest, Keeper of Graves, World Route Commander. I preferred Gardener. Months later, I stood at the edge of the restored orchard with Harper, Owen, and a whisper of Rowan moving through the branches. Living apple trees grew beside bone-white guardians. The arrangement was messy, impossible, and stronger because neither side owned the other. I pressed my bark-covered hand to the soil. Far below the ordinary roots, something tapped back. The signal came from beneath the ocean floor, deeper than the demon grave, and older than the world tree. It was not a living seed. It was not exactly dead either. Its memory contained a sky with unfamiliar stars, and a forest tall enough to shade continents. Rowan went silent. My first dry vine curled once around my wrist. Everyone had spent centuries burying dangerous things, and trusting the ground to keep their secrets. The ground had started telling me where they were.